open up the floodgates and we'll get rolling.
We'll get it going.
Good morning, everybody. It is 9 o'clock on Monday, October 26th. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and staff, and we are starting up on our 900 series rulemaking today. We are allowing folks to Zoom in. We've got 68 participants so far. We will start with the roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjaba.
Here.
Commissioner Putnam. Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 6 out of 7 commissioners present.
Excellent. Okay. With that, I would first turn to commissioners. Does anybody have any information or other items that need to be brought to our attention? And hearings manager Larson, I would let the record reflect that Commissioner Putnam just joined us, so we now have 7 out of 7. Good morning, Commissioner Putnam. Good to see you.
Good morning.
Commissioner Gonzalez. Commissioner Gonzalez. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a quick disclosure to make here before we get started with the 900 series rulemaking. As many people know, I am currently serving on the board of directors for a local nonprofit called Growing Home. Growing Home is an anti-poverty organization that supports children and families in North Metro Denver by implementing a dual generation approach to helping them overcome immediate and long-term barriers to stability and to success. And I've been involved with Growing Home since 2009, and my service with the board is in a 100% volunteer capacity for which I receive no compensation. It has come to my attention that Growing Home is being considered for as a possible beneficiary for funds next year by a nonprofit arm of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, that being the Colorado Energy Foundation. COGA is a party to this rulemaking, and I thought it appropriate to disclose this matter publicly. It is my understanding that COGA and/or the Colorado Energy Foundation may have sponsored or supported Growing Home in the past prior to my appointment to this commission. I do not know the details of such support, and besides being notified of this matter last week, I have not participated in any discussions or decisions by Growing Home or COGA associated with this or any other fundraising effort related to COGA or the Colorado Energy Foundation. I plan to make a similar disclosure at the next Growing Home Board of Directors meeting, as well as recuse myself from any such future discussions and decisions related to this matter. I do not believe that this poses a conflict or that I will be unable to impartially evaluate the matters before me in my role as commissioner. And this disclosure is being made in an effort to promote maximum transparency.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez, and thank you for your work on the nonprofit. That sounds excellent, and I see no issues with that, but I think we all appreciate the transparency, so great. Anything else from commissioners before we roll into our agenda? Okay, seeing none, the first order of business is consent agenda. We have several, I think 20 hearing officer recommendations. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, concerns about consent agenda? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not a concern, but I was reading I think it's the NOAV for KRIS. I hope I'm pronouncing all this right. KRIS. And it sounded like they had purchased some pipeline from another entity and discovered when they were doing an integrity test that the pipe, it almost sounded like the pipe had been eaten away. And I was wondering if we have concerns about the rest of the piping or if this is a regular occurrence that happens. And I just would like a little background about that particular issue, pipeline and the integrity of pipeline and the frequency with which we test it.
Hearings Manager Larson, do you or your enforcement team, can they speak to that for us?
Yes, we do have Mr. Scott Schultz, who is available and can speak to it. Mr. Neslin, who is counsel, I believe, to Karis, is also in the meeting and can be available to answer that question. So if you like, I can bring Mr. Neslin in to speak as well.
Why don't we start with Mr. Schultz and see where we go with that? Mr. Schultz.
Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you for your question, Commissioner McGowan. Short answer is no, we do not have concerns regarding this particular pipeline. This was an asset that Karis acquired from Encana back in 2017. They quickly did some testing within a month of when they purchased this asset. And that was part of this case, is that when they were testing this pipeline, there was a release, and that caused the violations. There's 3 separate one-day violations, but there was the remediation has been completed to the satisfaction of COGC staff, and we don't have any specific concerns regarding this pipeline.
I see that Mr. Neslin has raised his hand. Ms. Larson, do you want to bring him to the panel to see if he has anything further to contribute? Mr. Neslin, you are part of the panel. Would you like to speak to this?
Commissioners, yes, if I could speak briefly to this.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Neslin.
All right. Commissioner McGowan, thank you for that question. As Assistant Attorney General Schultz explained, upon acquiring the pipelines, Karis immediately initiated a comprehensive and voluntary pipeline monitoring and testing program, which identified this particular release point. The spill actually occurred during the testing process and was immediately shut in. The pipeline was immediately emptied and locked out and tagged out, and then the impacts were remediated, as Mr. Schultz explained. The program, though, applied to all of the pipelines that had been acquired by Karis. Approximately 1,000 miles of pipeline were ultimately tested in coordination with the COGCC staff as part of a regulatory compliance program. That process led to the abandonment of many miles of pipeline and the adoption of a very rigorous monitoring program, which is currently in force and which exceeds COGCC requirements. So there's some additional information for you on this particular release and the broader context of Karis's testing program and evaluation of all of the pipelines that it acquired from Encana.
Thank you, Mr. Neslin. Commissioner McGowan, did you have any follow-up?
No, that was helpful to know that they've completed the testing, all the pipeline that they acquired, and that we feel good about the rest of the integrity of the rest, or some of it's been shut down. So thanks for the additional information. I appreciate it.
Certainly.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Neslin. Thank you, staff, for being available. Are there other questions concerning consent agenda? All right, seeing none, do we have a motion to approve consent agenda?
I'll move approval of the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
And we have a second from Commissioner Nanjapa. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, consent agenda is approved. So we successfully got the roll call and consent agenda. The next docketed matter is the Director Staff Summary of Final Proposed 900 Series Rules in the Mission Change Rulemaking, docket number 200600115. Director Murphy, I think the floor is yours and your staff.
Thank you, Chair. And I would ask AG Minor or Ms. Larson to queue up the PowerPoint. I think it's Ms. Larson, actually. And we'll get our presenters going. While the agenda says summary, I don't want anybody to think that this is going to be quick. We have prepared a pretty detailed review to the tune of probably 2 hours of staff talking alone. And we want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions, but figured I should tell everybody to hold on to your seats and maybe get a cushion and a gigantic cup of coffee. This is scintillating, but long. So with that, you know, I think we all appreciate having a little bit of space over the last couple of weeks. I certainly am a little bit better rested and more organized, and suspect all of our stakeholders are as well. But, you know, today we are jumping back into the 800, 900, 1200 rulemaking. This is the second of 3 rule series proposed by staff for changes. And if we put that in the broader context with the 2 through 600 rulemaking, we are on the 7th of 8 rule series, which to me is glorious because we are entering the end of rulemaking and the beginning of implementation. And that's a really exciting, dynamic time. Next slide, please. Maybe. Perfect, thank you. So I wanted to start with an overview covering a couple of topics. You know, the core components of this rule series and the coordination with CDPHE, I think, are particularly important to understand at the beginning. And again, you know, given the technical depth of the rules, the scope, and the importance of staff's proposed revisions, we are going to take some time to move through these rule series in detail. The 900 series is a set of rules focused on protecting the environment, primarily through ensuring proper management of EMP waste and cleanup in the event of a spill or release. I use the term EMP waste here, knowing that Mr. Duranlo will define it for us and for the stakeholders later on. It's an important term in our rules, so I'll use it now and promise that it's going to be defined. The 900 series really interrelates with many of the previous rule series we have presented to you and already discussed. For example, rules 901 and 902 correlate with the enforcement provisions of the 500 series. The EMP waste management plans in the 300 series relate to rules 903 and 905 through 910. And the on-site management of EMP waste interrelates with the 400 and 600 series operational requirements. Similarly, correct records and closure reporting relating to pits complements many of the 200 series provisions. Ultimately, one of the pieces that we do need to discuss today and that I will present to you is the connection between the cumulative impacts data gathering in the 300 series and an opportunity for evaluating those impacts through a reporting and recommendation requirement in Rule 904. Stay tuned. I think another really important piece of these rules is that we've moved and reordered many of the rules. Today, you will hear frequently, we moved this rule into the 900 series. Similarly, you will hear frequently, this is an existing requirement, or perhaps you read that statement multiple times in the statement of basis and purpose. This reflects that EMP waste management and environmental protection is an area in which many of our existing rules protect the environment. However, there are key places in which staff is proposing changes to the 900 series that are necessary to implement the directives of Senate Bill 19-181. Another little kind of nugget to pay attention to is that today we will again be talking about both 19-181 and 89-181. And I know AAG Minor and others are going to touch on the difference between those two. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the coordination with CDPHE that has gone into the 900 series to me is unprecedented. We have worked closely with 3 different divisions within CDPHE, water quality, air quality, and waste, including 2 of the sections within the waste division. We've also conferred with CPW for wildlife-related provisions in the 900 series. I am incredibly proud of this collaborative work as it has synergized our organizations, us, within the Department of Natural Resources and divisions within the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment to efficiently and with clarity carry out our respective statutory objectives. And I want to thank especially Executive Director / Commissioner Putnam for the work of his staff on these rules. Next slide, please. I'm going to run through some of the key rule changes that you will hear about today from other staff members. In Rule 901, we're modifying existing Rule 901C to expand the director's ability to require operators to take action to address imminent threats to the environment and other key resources. This rule also improves due process for operators and takes full advantage of you, our full-time commissioners, by allowing expedited commission hearings. Rule 902 similarly carries forward current Rule 324 Big A, which is important for enforcement-related issues. It also includes reasonable sidebars on the director's discretion. Ms. Larson will spend some time discussing these two rule provisions today in greater detail. Moving into 903, and this to me is really the meat of the technical and depth and where we will spend quite a bit of time today on venting and flaring. And Mr. Duranlo and Mr. Leonard in particular will be presenting a lot of different pieces of information about this. I think what's most interesting to me about 903 is that it truly touches on every aspect of our agency, from permitting, including our surface use permit or oil and gas location assessment staff, our environmental staff, our engineering staff, and our field inspection staff. Previously, pieces of what is now proposed as Rule 903 were scattered about through different rule series. In working through this rule as proposed by staff, our team has learned our different units have used slightly different words to discuss venting, flaring, and the associated pieces of equipment. And through this process, our team has learned how to end each other's sentences about venting, flaring, safety, and waste. Our focus, no matter who is describing it on staff, is that we know the goal is to get the gas that should be in the pipe, in the pipe. This rule has also required incredibly close coordination with Air Pollution Control Division, as the staff within CDPHE has been making incredible strides in implementing their authority to also reduce emissions from the oil and gas sector. As our stakeholders well know, we have partnered with staff from the division to reduce overlap while providing clarity and consistency and acknowledging the work that each respective organization is doing to provide kind of uniform and implementable requirements. So to recap, we've created synergies between our teams within CDPHE and COGCC, which we believe will provide consistent environmental protections in the venting and flaring requirements proposed in Rule 903. Getting into the substance, venting and flaring, we have consolidated rules from the 300, 600, 800, and 900 series into a single rule. We have strengthened emissions control protections to protect public health, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. We have also proposed phasing out routine venting and flaring from existing sites and requiring gas capture plans as appropriate. This is a big rule, and we're going to spend a lot of time on it today, and I know it's critically important to many of our stakeholders. Moving next to Rule 904. Again, I'm going to address this in greater detail at the end of my presentation, so hold on to the seats of your pants. It's going to be great. But this is really the rule where we are working on implementing some of the important directives from Senate Bill 181 related to cumulative impacts. Jumping into Rule 905 and EMP waste management, the rule identifies options for managing different categories of EMP waste as appropriate to protect the environment, wildlife resources, public health, etc. Sometimes it's fun to reorder those and trip myself up. It also requires waste management plans for all facilities to encourage operators to identify and implement front-end planning about EMP waste. In addition, it improves protections for surface water and groundwater, and this is based on our consultations with CDPHE. Rules 908, 909, and 910 relate to pits. This again is another important topic about which there has been a great deal of stakeholder input. We believe the proposed rules strengthen environmental protections for both new and existing pits. In particular, characterizing the produced water pursuant to 909J goes a long way towards better managing EMP wastes in pits to protect wildlife, public health, and the environment. I also want to flag that staff is proposing a change to its October 13th draft in some of the pit rules that we will discuss later today. In Rule 912, staff is proposing to clarify spill and release reporting obligations, adopting new standards for reporting spills, releases of indeterminate volumes, and ensuring all relevant parties receive notice of spills and releases. And lastly, and finally, to the final bullet point on this slide, Rule 915, we are updating the 915.1 standards based on CDPHE's Waste Division updating its own cleanup standards. We have worked very closely with the Waste Division within CDPHE on these requirements and are proud of the work that has gone into it. In addition, we have provided some flexibility for operators to adhere to background concentrations on a site-by-site basis. But again, that's that it requires a fair amount of understanding of what the situation is and what the parameter or the constituent is. Next slide, please. So I am going to walk through a couple of conforming edits to the 200 through 600 series. Based on our changes to Rule 903E1, we are suggesting that the Commission consider revising Rule 304C12 to reflect that a gas capture plan could also be a commitment consistent with the requirements of 903E, and that provides some flexibility for operators to commit that the proposed location will be connected rather than submitting a gas capture plan. We also recommend that the Commission consider adopting a new Rule 405S consistent with staff's proposed changes to 903D1 Big E. In 903D1 Big E, staff is proposing that a Form 42 field operation notice for well liquids unloading be required. Well liquids unloading is another complicated topic that Mr. Duranlo will discuss in detail. Next slide, please. And this is the change that I flagged in my previous comments about Rule 909. Staff is proposing a change to Rule 909F that would strike "and existing" and also strike the language "unless waived by CPW pursuant to Rule 1202A. Staff is also recommending comparable changes in Rule 1202, which we will be discussing during the 1200 series. And the changes together in 909 and the 1200 series would require that all new pits be fenced or netted, and that existing pits will require fencing or netting based on a case-by-case review, which is comparable to the existing requirements. As we continued to evaluate the proposal of fencing and netting pits, we considered that there are a few thousand pits across the state of Colorado, and given the important changes in COGCC's pit requirements through time, the number of wildlife-related incidences is fairly limited, and therefore we should consider the conditions of the pit, what's in it, and again, thinking back to the requirement for produced water characterization, so we understand what is in the pit as a component in understanding whether fencing and netting is required. We have also seen situations where fencing or wildlife exclusion devices have actually created more of a hazard for wildlife. So we believe that in coordination with our partners at CPW, we be given the authority to evaluate on a case-by-case basis whether existing pits require fencing or netting. Next slide. This is, I believe, our final proposed change to staff's October 13th, 2020 draft. In 909J1C, we suggest that the testing requirement include not just testing for total dissolved solids, but also suspended solids, total suspended solids, which we believe in conversations with our partners at CDPHE, this would allow a single test to be performed by an operator that would comply with both COGCC and CDPHE T-norm regulations. And we think this is an important way to reduce the chance that an operator has to test twice. So that's the purpose of the change. Next slide, please. Oop, I wasn't quite right. I forgot about this change. I apologize. Proposed changes, another proposed change to staff's 10/13/2020 draft is in 909J5, and this would allow operators to conduct a single analysis of produced water from the same formation in the same unit sent to the same pit. And we believe that this provides, again, enough information about the produced water being placed into the pit to let our staff make appropriate analysis of the situation and understand what is the E&P waste's characteristics. So with that, next slide, please. Jumping into Rule 904, and this is really the only substantive rule that I'm here to present to you today. We believe that 904, again, is a very important connection between the 300 series and the data that we are gathering as well as the data that is being gathered throughout CDPHE around oil and gas emissions in particular, and air quality, and bringing that information back to you, commissioners, so that you have the opportunity to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. What we have proposed in new Rule 904A is that annually staff will report to the Commission in coordination with CDPHE about 4 data sets. First would be the CIDR data that is gathered from the COGCC 300 series rules. And it is the Cumulative Impacts Data Evaluation Repository, for those of us who actually want to know what the acronym stands for. We believe that it will be important as we continue to collect information in this database that it is presented to you, commissioners, for the opportunity to evaluate and understand what it is we are learning about oil and gas development across the state. It probably will vary by basin, and I think that it will continue to grow into a very informative database for us and stakeholders. The second component of information that we have recommended that it would be presented to the Commission is work on the state's greenhouse gas roadmap. That work is primarily being performed by CDPHE, but we can use what is occurring publicly and in coordination with CDPHE to bring back that information to this Commission, and especially the sector-related requirements. Third, we would propose that staff and in coordination with CDPHE reports on the oil and gas emissions inventory that Air Quality Control Division is collecting from oil and gas. Again, the goal here in my mind is to synergize and work together with CDPHE and ensure that our commissioners and CDPHE is aware of the work that is being done by operators in their reporting to CDPHE and what work CDPHE is doing on that. We need to work closely for a number of reasons to avoid duplication and to also achieve the state's goals as codified in statute. And then the last piece of data that we would recommend be reported to the Commission annually is about the ozone non-attainment information. And again, that is information that's related to CDPHE's work, but we think it's appropriate to bring it forward to you so that you continue to be informed about what's happening statewide. The fifth component of the annual report, which is not data related, but is actually forward-looking and is the opportunity to not only evaluate, but also address cumulative impacts as required by Senate Bill 19-181, would be staff's proposals to address the information presented. And we think that that provides us flexibility to think about, as we look at COGCC's rules, guidance, et cetera, what is working, what could be better, what needs fine-tuned. And so that is the broad proposal in Rule 904. It doesn't take up a lot of room on the page, but I think it is a critically important rule, and it reflects a lot of us staff thinking about how we can partner with the data that we're collecting, as well as the work being performed at CDPHE, and bring forward to you recommendations that make sense. Last, we have also retained in large part the existing proposed Rule 904A as new 904B, that operators may be required to participate in studies. With that, next slide, please. And we are almost at the conclusion of hearing from me, which is always my favorite part of the day, because I get to turn it over to the folks who have been the subject matter experts on these rule series, and you can hear from them, their passion, their expertise, etc. AAG Minor will kick us off on some of the legal issues, just to lay the foundation for staff's approach to the legal questions. He will turn it over to Hearings Officer or Hearings Manager Larson to talk about 901 and 902 as I discussed. Ms. Larson will turn it over to Mike Leonard and then Greg Duranlo to discuss Rule 903. My recommendation, Commissioners, is that we make it through Mr. Duranlo's presentation on 903, take a break, we'll all need it. Hell, we might need it after my talk here. But to take a break and then regroup and have questions about, the first few rules of the 900 series. They kind of break together nicely. At that point, after taking your questions on those rules, we can jump into the remaining 900 series, and that will again be Mr. Duranlo presenting on rules 905 through 910, and he will then hand it off to Mr. John Axelson, who is our East Environmental Supervisor, to present on Rules 9:11 through 9:15. Of all of the folks presenting to you today formally, Mr. Axelson is new, and I would just acknowledge that his steady, thoughtful leadership has guided so many of the changes we've proposed, and he's mentored so many of our staff members. His expertise and experience will shine as he walks us through the cleanup requirements, and that really builds back to something that I want the commissioners to hear very clearly, is that staff has proposed changes to the 900 series largely based on its experience with regulating oil and gas, dealing with cleanups, etc. These are really framed by our deep experience and expertise in this space, and we're really proud of these requirements because I think it addresses some of the places that we've seen challenges, and also which aligns nicely with the directives of 181, certainly. Lastly, we do have 3 people on call on staff to answer your questions. These folks have been really absolutely integral to preparing the changes to the 900 series. We have Miss Diana Byrne, who we heard from during the 800 series. She again is our Eastern Region Engineering Supervisor. We also have Dr. Peter Gontadas, who we heard from during the 400 series. And he's an environmental protection specialist with a deep expertise in things that I barely understand around chemistry. And also Dr. Denise Arthur, and she is an incredible resource for our agency. She understands topsoil, she understands plants, she understands noxious weeds, she understands reclamation, and she's just a wealth of information. And with the introduction of Dr. Denise, you now have met all 3 of our PhDs, Dr. Denise, Dr. Peter, and Dr. Bob. Again, staff is incredibly proud of the rules it has worked so hard on with so many stakeholders and shaped by its own experience. And with that, I would turn it over to AAG Minor, and we look forward to your questions today, commissioners, and thank you for bearing with me for a fairly lengthy discussion.
Thank you, Director Murphy. AAG Minor, I believe you have been teed up for the next presentation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Murphy. And good morning, Commissioners. Ms. Amaro, if we could go to the next slide. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of a variety of different legal issues that are implicated by the 900 series rules. First, I'm going to discuss the procedural protections that are in place to ensure that operators receive due process under Rule 901A. Next, I'm going to explain the Administrative Procedure Act's incorporation by reference provisions and how those are implemented by Rule 901B. And third, I will describe the legal basis for the Commission's relationship with other state and federal agencies that are also charged with environmental protection. And finally, I'm going to provide an overview of the responsible party provisions of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act and how they apply in the remediation context, especially with respect to Rule 905A5. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Turning first to the due process safeguards in Rule 901A, I'm going to revisit some important points that I made while discussing similar rules during staff's presentation on the 200 and 300 series rules. As you recall, Colorado law and the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Act specifically allow the Commission to delegate its authority to the director so long as there are reasonable constraints on that delegation. Specifically, Section 104.5, Subpart 2 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act authorizes the director to administer the act and enforce the Commission's rules. In Rule 901A, staff proposes that the Commission do exactly that, delegate to the director its statutory authority under the act to protect and minimize adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources by allowing the director to require operators to avoid, minimize, or mitigate imminent threats to any of those resources. Actual or potential threats to the environment that would violate the act may require rapid response by staff and action by an operator before a quorum of commissioners are able to assemble. This type of discretionary authority is therefore appropriate for the Commission to delegate to the director, and the discretion is constrained by the words reasonable cause, which also appear in the current version of the rule, which is Rule 901C. The term reasonable cause is not the only procedural safeguard in Rule 901A. As Hearings Manager Larson will discuss in more detail, Rule 901A adopts a new expedited appeal standard to ensure that operators receive due process. The standard is probably familiar to you because it's the same expedited appeal process that the Commission provisionally approved in Rules 209B and 602F. Like Rules 209B and 602F, Rule 901A authorizes the Director to address situations that may violate the Act, but not a specific rule, but nevertheless pose an imminent threat to the environment. Rule 901A is also consistent with Section 24.4.104 of the Colorado Administrative Procedure Act, which requires that in most cases, before an agency takes action to limit or modify a permit, the agency must give the permittee notice, provide, quote, a reasonable opportunity to comply with all lawful requirements, and allow submission of written arguments. This is sometimes called notice and an opportunity to cure. Proposed Rule 901A3 ensures that any operator subject to action under Rule 901A will receive due process by providing notice and an opportunity to cure through the expedited appeal of the Director's decision to the Commission. This is shown by the red arrow on the screen. The expedited appeal thus bypasses the ordinary process, which is shown with green arrows on the screen, which would involve first appealing to a hearing officer or administrative law judge. So next slide, please. I will now explain the incorporations by reference in Rule 901B and why they look different from the incorporations by reference that you've seen in other series. The screen shows a summary of the Colorado Administrative Procedure Act's incorporation by reference provision, which is found in Colorado Revised Statute, Section 24.4.103, Subpart 12.5a. The APA allows agencies to incorporate by reference all or part of a code, standard, guideline, or rule that has been adopted by another state or federal agency or a nationally recognized organization like the American Petroleum Institute. When an agency chooses to reference another entity's standards in its rules, the APA requires the agency to fully identify what materials are being incorporated, to only incorporate the current version and not future versions, and to explain where a member of the public can access the incorporated materials. This ensures that an agency can only incorporate and enforce a standard issued by another agency that the public can review free of charge. It also ensures that the substantive requirements of an agency's rules cannot change without a rulemaking hearing, even if the outside agency or organization chooses to update the standard that was incorporated at some point in the future. Throughout the Commission's current rules and throughout the rules that have been adopted so far in this mission change rulemaking, provisionally adopted, there are dozens of incorporations by reference. Page 6 of the October 20th Draft 900 Series Statement of Basis and Purpose lists all 30 rules in the 400, 600, 800, and 1100 series that include incorporations by reference. Most of the time, staff put the full language required by the APA in the text of the rule where the reference is made. This probably looks familiar to you by now, text listing the name and year of an industry standard or agency rule, followed by a list of places that the rule is available, including the Commission's public reading room here in the Denver office. However, staff have proposed a slightly different approach for the 900 series, listing all standards incorporated by reference at the start of the series to avoid breaking up the regulatory text every time another agency's rules were incorporated. Staff proposed this for a simple reason. The Water Quality Control Commission's Regulation 41 is referenced no fewer than 26 different times in the 900 series. Including all of the required text each time Regulation 41 is referenced would not only make many rules difficult to read, it would also increase the length of the 900 series by about 5 pages. So staff proposed to put all of the incorporations by reference in the 900 series into a single rule, 901B. This is to make the language more readable and to limit confusion. Legally, there is no difference between providing an incorporation by reference in Rule 901B and providing it in the text of an individual rule. The fact that another agency's regulations are referenced in 901B does not mean that the Commission has power to enforce those rules in all situations statewide. It just means that an operator must adhere to the other agency's rules when a specific commission rule requires them to do so because the other agency's rules are applicable to oil and gas operations. Let's consider one example. Rule 901B3E incorporates the Colorado State Board of Water Well Construction and Pump Installation Contractors rules for water well construction, pump installation, cistern installation, and monitoring and observation hole well construction, which is better known as the State Engineer's Office Water Well Construction Rules. Current Rule 908B9B, Romanet 1, requires operators to adhere to these rules when they construct groundwater monitoring wells at centralized E&P waste management facilities. Staff have proposed to carry forward that rule unchanged into Rule 907B9. Rule 907B9 thus incorporates the State Engineer's Office water well construction rules by reference. But instead of putting all the information about where to find those rules in the text of Rule 907B9, staff has proposed to put that information in Rule 901B. This does not mean that the Commission could enforce the State Engineer's Office rules at every single water well in the state. It just means that when a groundwater monitoring well is built at a centralized E&P waste management facility, a facility that is well within the Commission's jurisdiction, the Commission could take enforcement action if an operator failed to adhere to the State Engineer's Office rules when constructing that well. Next slide, please. Many of the proposed 900 series rules are best understood in the context of their relationship with regulations promulgated by other agencies, specifically CDPHE and EPA, which are the other state and federal agencies charged with environmental protection. In the course of developing the proposed 900 series rules, staff collaborated closely with staff from all three of CDPHE's environmental divisions, the Air Pollution Control Division, or APCD, Water Quality Control Division, or WQCD, and the Hazardous Materials and Waste Management Division. Accordingly, as Director Murphy mentioned earlier, staff from each of these agencies are going to be available to answer questions this morning. Legally, there is no prohibition on two state agencies regulating the same activity. Unlike the relationship between different levels of government, for example, local governments and the state government, or the state government and the federal government, there is no preemption between state agencies. It is common for two agencies to regulate the same activity. For example, the Air Quality Control Commission is involved with setting vehicle emission standards, but the Department of Revenue's Division of Motor Vehicles also regulates vehicle registration. The General Assembly has conferred authority to both the AQCC and the DMV to regulate motor vehicles, just for different reasons. The same is true for oil and gas operations. The General Assembly has conferred both CDPHE and COGCC authority to regulate oil and gas operations. This is made clear in Senate Bill 19-181 by the General Assembly amending Colorado Revised Statute, Section 34-60-105, Subpart 1B, to clarify the delegating authority to COGCC to regulate oil and gas operations does not negate the authority of CDPHE to also regulate those operations. In the air context, staff carefully tailored Rule 903 to minimize unnecessary duplication between the AQCC's regulation of oil and gas sector emissions and COGCC's regulation of venting and flaring. Staff proposes to do so in the interest of efficiency and streamlining regulatory enforcement. This reflects that both AQCC and COGCC have legal authority in the same arena, not that there is a legal prohibition on overlapping regulations between those two agencies. Turning to waste, the Commission's primary role in regulating the management and safe disposal of exploration and production, or E&P waste, stems from the fact that E&P waste is exempt from the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. Thus, although CDPHE's Hazardous Materials and Waste Management Division does play a key role in regulating non-E&P waste, such as tank bottoms or trash on an oil and gas location, as well as the landfill disposal of E&P waste, many E&P waste regulations fall primarily to COGCC. Accordingly, staff have coordinated closely with CDPHE staff to ensure consistency between the agency's waste management regulations wherever possible. This includes updating Table 915-1 to match CDPHE's current standards for soil cleanup and to adopt standards for characterizing produced water in Rule 909J that will facilitate compliance with CDPHE's proposed T-norm regulations. And finally, as I have discussed during staff presentations on earlier rule series, the other Senate Bill 181, Senate Bill 89-181, makes COGCC an implementing agency for the Water Quality Control Commission's groundwater classifications and standards. Staff have therefore worked closely with the Water Quality Control Division to ensure that the 900 series rules facilitate compliance with WQCC groundwater classifications and standards, as well as surface water discharge regulations. Next slide, please. Another legal issue that has come up during prior rule series is the Oil and Gas Conservation Act's responsible party provisions. On the screen, you can see the Act's definition of a responsible party. The responsible party provision is found in Section 124 of the Act, which creates the Orphan Well Program. The statute authorizes the Commission to require a responsible party to perform certain remediation and investigation activities to address potential risks to air, water, soil, and biological resources. Rule 905A5 implements the statutory provision, which governs when an operator may be required to conduct investigation and remediation activities at a closed location. It is necessary to address situations where investigation and remediation may be warranted outside the context of a formal enforcement action. Rule 905A5 requires the director to act only based upon evidence that an operator is responsible for the contamination being investigated or remediated. As explained on pages 39 to 40 of the October 20th draft statement of basis and purpose, requiring an operator to act based on this form of evidence is a responsible party determination. The director will only take this action if staff can meet the evidentiary burden to prove that an operator is indeed a responsible party. If an operator disagrees with the director's determination, the operator may seek a hearing before the Commission pursuant to Rule 503G10 and raise an affirmative defense that a different person is in fact a responsible party, consistent with Rule 526, or contest the director's evidence. And with that, I will now turn it over to Hearings Manager Larson to discuss Rules 901 and 902.
Thank you very much, Assistant Attorney General Minor. Good morning, Commissioners. I am presenting this morning on Rules 901 and 902. Staff's proposed revisions to Rule 901A expands upon the Director's current Rule 901C authority. Current Rule 901C provides that the Director may impose additional requirements for remediation, sampling, and testing if there exists reasonable cause to believe an operator is or may violate current Table 910-1 standards. Revised Rule 901A allows the Director to take necessary steps to protect public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or wildlife resources in situations when there are threatened or potential impacts to any environmental media, not just soil and groundwater. For instance, the Director may require an operator to suspend operations until the threat to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or wildlife resources is identified and corrected. Rule 901A2 allows the Director to require an operator to submit a Form 27, which is a site investigation and remediation work plan. It is important to note that a Form 27 will not be required in every circumstance. Rule 901A provides that a Form 27 or suspension of operations are possible actions the Director may require an operator take. Depending upon the threat posed, the circumstances surrounding the potential or actual threat or impact, and the environmental media involved, a Form 27 or suspension of operations may or may not be required, and the Director may find other actions necessary to be taken. As Mr. Minor explained, the staff has taken care to ensure that Rule 901A has in place procedural guardrails. Staff's proposed rule ensures that should an operator disagree with the director's actions, the operator may seek from the commission an expedited hearing. To seek an expedited hearing, an operator files a hearing application with the commission. That hearing application is assigned to the full commission, not to a hearing officer or an administrative law judge. The operator's hearing application is heard at the commission's next regularly scheduled hearing. And with the full-time commission, the commission's hearing schedule has been expanded with multiple regularly scheduled meetings occurring each month. Therefore, an operator's expedited hearing application would be heard promptly. Staff's proposed rule revisions are consistent with and necessary to implement its new mandate under Senate Bill 19-181. The Oil and Gas Act at 3460-106 2.5a directs the commission to, quote, protect against adverse environmental impacts on any air, water, soil, or biological resources resulting from oil and gas operations, end quote. The changes proposed to Rule 901A implement this provision of Senate Bill 19-181. With respect to Rule 901B, you heard from Mr. Minor as to why it is necessary for the Commission's rules to identify and incorporate by reference rules and standards of other agencies or entities. I will not revisit this issue for you. Next slide, please. Moving on to Rule 902, proposed Rule 902A proposes that operators will prevent pollution. Staff proposes that the definition of pollution be revised to replace the phrase man-made with anthropogenic. Second, staff proposes adding the following clause to the definition of pollution to provide that it would be anything that is, quote, not authorized or allowed by the Commission's rules or applicable regulations promulgated by another federal, state, or local government agency, end quote. Including this clause excludes contamination and degradation of air, water, soil, and biological resources that may be expressly allowed by another regulatory authority. For example, air permits issued by the Colorado Air Pollution Control Division set acceptable levels of emissions from sources. An operator's lawful emission of pollution levels permitted under an Air Pollution Control Division permit would not fall under the Commission's definition of pollution. Rule 902B incorporates portions of current Rule 324 Big A, Little a. The revisions proposed in Rule 902B reflect Senate Bill 19-181's amendments. For instance, current Rule 324 Big A, Little a requires operators to take precautions to prevent significant adverse environmental impacts, taking into account, quote, cost effectiveness and technical feasibility, end quote. However, Senate Bill 19-181 removed cost effectiveness and technical feasibility when considering environmental impacts. And accordingly, staff has proposed to remove this language from the rule. Rule 902B also requires operators to, quote, prevent adverse environmental impacts on any air, water, soil, or biological resource, end quote, and to, quote, protect and minimize adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources, end quote. The Director's enforcement of Rule 902B is naturally limited by Senate Bill 1981's definition of minimize adverse impacts. The Oil and Gas Act defines minimize adverse impacts to mean, quote, to the extent necessary and reasonable to protect public health, safety, and welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources, end quote. Therefore, it would not be necessary or reasonable for the Director to pursue an enforcement action against an operator for a permitted activity that may have an adverse impact on the environment. Again, going back to the example of an Air Pollution Control Division permit, an operator's lawful emission under that permit could arguably have an impact on the environment. However, the emission is lawful, and therefore an enforcement action by the COGCC would not be appropriate. Now I will turn the presentation over to Mr. Leonard, who will discuss Rule 903.
Thank you, Mrs. Larson. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Mike Leonard, Compliance Unit Manager, and happy to be addressing you again today. This time on the topic of venting and flaring of natural gas. First, we'll talk about the definitions of both. Second, we can talk about notice, and then we can talk a little bit about drilling and completion operations. So to start with flaring, COGCC defines flaring as the combustion of natural gas, except for the gas that is combusted to control emissions from tanks. That gas would be regulated by Air Quality Control Commission's Regulation 7. In the slide, on the slide in the left photo are enclosed emission control devices, or you'll hear them later called enclosed combustion devices, that destruct tank emissions, and on the right are enclosed flares used to destruct gas during flowback or upset conditions. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about venting. And what is venting? Well, venting means allowing the natural gas to escape into the atmosphere. And as you heard from Director Murphy earlier, and definition that AAG Minor has mentioned, and I'll paraphrase it, gas that should be going to the gathering line needs to be going to the gathering line or destructed, otherwise it's being vented. This does become complicated at times. So when we talk about venting, it may be best to describe what it is not. So it is not venting if the gas is used for the operation of equipment that is designed to emit gas as part of normal operation. Secondly, leaks that may occur are not venting unless those leaks are from inadequate equipment design. I'm going to use somewhat an exaggerated example, but visualize a pressure relief safety valve that is designed not to open until the pressure reaches 50 pounds per square inch. And then that valve is installed on a vessel that consistently operates at pressures of 80 pounds per square inch. In this example, the valve would be constantly releasing or venting. And third, gas coming from or downstream of a tank is not venting unless there's no separation occurring at the equipment upstream of the tank, or in other words, the tank becomes the separator. The separation equipment is too small to separate the amount of gas from the liquids being produced, or the gas being sent to the combustion equipment and that equipment is not operating correctly. So in other words, gas is going to the flare, but the flare is not burning it. Now let's move on to a topic I've discussed with you before, and that's notice. More importantly, notice to emergency response. Next slide, please. Current Rule 317P requires gas escaping from a well during drilling operations be directed to a point a safe distance from the well and burned. This rule goes on to say that the operator shall notify emergency dispatch as provided by the local government designee of any such flaring. It also states that notices shall be given prior if the flaring can be anticipated, and if not, then no more than 2 hours after. For instances not related to drilling operations, current Rule 912E states that notice shall be given to the local emergency dispatch or the local government designee. Again, notice shall be given prior to the flaring when it can be reasonably anticipated, or as soon as possible, but no later than 2 hours after the event. Draft Rule 903A reorganizes and consolidates the current rules into one rule. The reasoning for notice is to allow the locals to know there is a flare or a fire occurring and it is controlled. Current rule only requires notice to the local emergency dispatch. And at times this can be problematic as different jurisdictions may have distant dispatch centers And this information really needs to be at the local level. This draft rule requires notice to the relevant and proximate local governments and the local emergency response authority for a planned flaring no later than 2 hours prior. This notice may be verbal, written, or electronic. Prior notice allows entities to prepare for public concerns or questions that may arise from the event, or to determine if they need to respond in a rapid manner when contacted by dispatch. The photos on this slide depict the same location from different vantage points. As you can see on the left, it appears that that tank could be on fire, but on the right, it's clearly a controlled flare. It's not up to the public or the dispatch center to determine the situation. If local responders know there is flaring occurring, it may allow for a less elevated response. For an unplanned or upset condition, verbal or electronic notice needs to be given to the same entities as soon as possible, but no more than 12 hours later. This allows entities to follow up with the appropriate operator should questions or concerns come forward. In keeping in line with local government authority, a local government or emergency response agency may waive their right to notice. And finally, operators must maintain records of all these notices and provide them to the director upon request. Next slide, please. As stated before, Rule 317P requires notice, and Draft Rule 903A that we just discussed covers that notice portion. 903B goes on to require that gas downstream of the mud gas separator must be captured or combusted while maintaining safe operating conditions. This piece of equipment separates gas that may come up with the drilling fluids used to drill the well. Typically, it's only used when a large influx of gas enters the wellbore, more commonly called a kick. So rather than just venting the gas and potentially allowing it to build to a volume that could ignite, it's safely captured and destructed with the flare. The photo on this slide depicts the positioning of the mud gas separator and the flare during the drilling operation. If for a safety reason this cannot be accomplished, if the flaring cannot be accomplished, the operator may vent the gas but needs to provide verbal notice to the director within 12 hours and submit a Form 4 explaining the situation within 7 days. The last section of 903B requires a minimum safety distance of 100 feet from the combustor to the nearest surface hole location. That distance allows for an adequate safety buffer between the flare and the nearby well. Next slide, please. Moving on to Draft Rule 903C, after the well is drilled, it may or may not be hydraulically fractured, depending on the formation that will be produced. So the next phase is the completion process, whereby the produced oil, gas, and water is brought to the surface. Typically, the liquids are directed to tanks and the gas will be directed to a gathering system for sale. However, early on in this process, the gas may not be of saleable quantity or quality, therefore it needs to be flared. This flaring is allowed with a gas capture plan or an approved Form 4. The photo on the left shows gas being destructed during the mill-out phase of the completion, which is performed prior to flowback. This gas cannot be sold as it is not pipeline quality or quantity. During the flowback phase, gas may not be of pipeline quality or quantity. In the photo on the right, liquids and gas enter the separation equipment marked number 1. They're separated into the 3 phases, oil, gas, and water. The oil and water are directed into the tanks, numbers 2 and 3, and unsaleable gas is directed to the flare, number 4, and destructed. Also, as with the production phase that Mr. Duranlo will explain in a bit, there will also be gas entrained in the oil. This gas comes out of or flashes off the oil while in the tank. Rule 903C requires this gas to be captured and destructed as well. This draft aligns with both the 2016 EPA Reduced Emission Completion Rule, much of which looks like the current 800 series green completion rules, and the Air Quality Control Commission's Regulation 7 regarding flowback vessels. Although the draft aligns with those rules, we do go a little farther in requiring all wells to use capture techniques, not just wells that are hydraulically fractured, as the EPA rule calls out. And finally, gas may be combusted if it's necessary to ensure safety during an upset condition not to exceed 24 hours. If that flaring must extend beyond 24 hours due to the upset condition, the operator must report the condition and the estimated volume of gas on a Form 4 within 7 days. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Duranlo.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Good morning, Commissioners. Though it feels a little redundant, once again, my name is Greg Duranlo, and I'm the manager of the Environmental Unit. In this presentation, I'm going to cover two topics: 903D, emissions during production operations, and 903E, gas capture plants. I want to start with a reminder of COGCC's focus in these rules: prevention of waste of natural gas. As both Director Murphy and Mr. Leonard already stated, we want to see all produced gas captured for sale or beneficial use that can be. This means reducing venting and flaring throughout the lifespan of every well. This focus on prevention of waste has significant environmental benefits because venting natural gas on site that could otherwise be sold releases methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, and other hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs. And combusting natural gas on site releases carbon dioxide, oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, and particulate matter. As you are all aware, the Air Quality Control Commission has broad authority over air pollution and emissions, including from oil and gas operations regulated by the COGCC. However, as described in the Statement of Basis and Purpose and covered by Assistant Attorney General Minor, this does not diminish the COGCC's authority and obligation to prevent waste and minimize adverse environmental impacts from upstream oil and gas operations. Next slide, please. This aerial image of an oil and gas location and my oversimplified process flow overlay is intended to show the distinction between COGCC and Air Quality Control Commission in our shared oversight of emissions from production operations. As you see, three-phase fluids come into the location from the left and are separated into oil, water, and gas phases. Any emissions from the pneumatic pumps, pneumatic controllers, or other equipment which releases gas by design for operational purposes is regulated under CDPHE's Regulation Number 7, or Reg 7. Water and oil are separated and sent to tanks in the battery at the top of the page. Flash gas emissions, those emissions which are a direct result of the volatilization or evaporation, if you will, of hydrocarbons from the water or oil, are captured and sent to emission control devices, typically enclosed combustion devices, or ECDs, for combustion and destruction, again under Reg 7. Finally, the natural gas associated or entrained in the production stream is separated and sent to a sales or gathering line, in this case through a series of compressors at the bottom of the page. The produced gas is the primary topic of Rule 903D, of 903D. If this gas is sent to a flare or vent, then that is a waste of the resources and should be prevented. Finally, it's important to note that even though the flare is the source of waste that COGCC is focused on, the flare itself remains subject to AQCC regulations. Simply stated, in this case, the product is the pollution. COGCC is focused on maximizing recovery of the product, and CDPHE is focused on minimizing the pollution. Now turning to Rule 903D, which specifically covers emissions during production operations, staff has proposed rules which generally cover former Rule 912 and also incorporate pit emissions from Rule 805B. First, Rule 903D prohibits venting or flaring during production operations. As Mr. Leonard already discussed, the definition of venting excludes the emissions from sources that I showed in the prior slide, such as pneumatic equipment and flash gas from storage tanks. The definition excludes unintentional leaks, which are generally covered by Air Quality Control Commission's Leak Detection and Repair, or LDAR, requirements. But the definition is clear that if produced gas is not separated or not adequately separated from the liquid streams prior to entering the storage tank, or gas is otherwise diverted to tanks instead of gathering systems, and that associated gas is released, it is venting. And simply put, flaring is the combustion of gas that, absent that combustion, would otherwise be vented. Now, the prohibition of venting and flaring does have some necessary exceptions, but staff has been careful to ensure that the exceptions do not swallow the rule. The exceptions are intended to cover the life of a well, and we did remove 2 previously listed exceptions in our draft rules, specifically those for pneumatic equipment and flash gas emissions, because they are now excluded from the definition of venting. The first exception is for short duration upset conditions. An upset condition is defined as sudden, unavoidable failure, breakdown, event, or malfunction beyond the reasonable control of the operator. We chose a 24-hour maximum cumulative duration because that provides time for operators to mobilize personnel and necessary equipment to rectify the situation. Beyond that, the site must be shut in. Many routine maintenance and repair activities require venting of gas in order to safely perform the operation. So the second exception in Rule 903 D1B is for maintenance and repair. It is not always possible to capture or combust the gas, but it is finite quantities in individual circumstances that are released. Our rule does require operational best practices to reduce venting during these maintenance and repair activities, but this exception does not allow continued venting or flaring while waiting on equipment or materials to complete the repair. It is only for active operations. Rule 903 D1C provides an allowance for flaring during a productivity test or production evaluation in wildcat or exploratory situations. Wildcats are wells drilled outside the bounds of a known oil and gas field, where the productivity of a well is uncertain at the time of permitting and drilling. This exception provides both the operator and their midstream partners the necessary information to design and invest in midstream gathering systems for the well or wells at a site. We've limited the duration of these events and tests to not more than 60 days, as that typically provides sufficient information to determine whether sufficient reservoir properties exist to support continued development and to adequately size production facilities. The fourth exception is for gas vented during a Braden head test. This is not intended to mean that an operator can leave the Braden head valve open during routine production, but just for the necessary duration to conduct the test. It is not feasible to capture this small amount of gas, and often it would not even be combustible. But the trade-off for the wellbore integrity information obtained by conducting the test far outweighs the emissions produced during the test. The fifth exception in 903 D1E is for certain well liquid unloading operations. Well liquids unloading is not intended to mean production operations by means of a plunger lift where the well unloads with each pump cycle, because those emissions generated during such production are already regulated under Air Quality Control Commission rules. This exception is intended for those downhole operations that are occasionally necessary and are manually initiated. In order to be covered by this exception, the operator must employ best management practices to minimize emissions as required by Reg 7. The operator must capture or flare the gas if it would otherwise pose a risk of fire, explosion, or toxicity. In other words, if the well unloading event is near people. Finally, we are requiring the operator to provide 48 hours notice on a Form 42. This notice will allow for COGCC inspectors in partnership with Air Pollution Control Division inspectors, if necessary, to witness the events, and it will provide the COGCC with valuable information as to the frequency, duration, and suite of best practices employed for these events. The sixth exception will be discussed further in a few minutes. It is for routine flaring or venting, for which the director approves a Form 4 pursuant to Rule 903D3. Rule 903D2 requires that for any of the first 5 exceptions that exceed 8 consecutive or 24 cumulative hours, the operator submit a Form 4 reporting the gas volume, gas analysis, a description of the need for the events, in other words, why it was necessary to flare or vent, and a description of any operational best management practices used to minimize venting for a maintenance or repair activity. This information requirement is only applied to longer duration events, which serves as a deterrent to allowing these events to continue for extended periods of time or to repeat. And it provides COGCC with valuable information about the nature of longer duration events. Next slide, please. This slide shows another oil and gas location where production from 2 on-site wells comes to a separator from which oil and water go to tanks in the lower left, and the gas stream is separated, but does not go to sales or other beneficial use. As you can see in the inset, the equipment on the lower right corner of the location consists of an open tip flare and 2 different enclosed combustion devices. When the site is in production, it looks like this. Next slide, please. Because there is no gathering, the operator flares the gas in order to produce the oil. This is not only a waste of resources, but as you can see from the particulate matter coming off the flame, it's also a source of unnecessary pollution. This routine flaring, which is common in Jackson County, is the subject of Rule 903D3. Next slide, please. Rule 903D3 requires operators of existing wells that are venting or flaring, instead of gathering gas or putting gas to a beneficial use, to obtain approval to continue to do so. This rule provides for a one-time 12-month approval by the director for continued routine flaring on a gas capture plan submitted via a Form 4. After that period, the operator must capture the gas for sales or beneficial use. Rule 903D3 specifies the informational requirements for the request, including gas volume, gas analysis, an explanation of the reason the well can't be connected to gathering infrastructure, a timeline for connection, and options for beneficial use or other impact reduction strategies. In addition to the routine flaring shown previously in Jackson County, there are a couple other production scenarios that are subject to this rule. The first are wells which have small volumes of gas which are necessary to be removed from the wellbore to facilitate production of liquids, yet the gas is of low quality, quantity, or consistency so that capture is technically infeasible. This is not uncommon in Fremont County. In the other scenario would be wells where a third-party gas gatherer stops taking gas, yet the well is still within its productive life. An example of this is the shutdown of the Third Creek gathering system in 2018. Operators of wells in all 3 of these routine flaring or venting scenarios need to develop a plan to stop wasting the resource. Rule 903D4 discusses measurement and reporting for flared, vented, or gas used on location. The rule requires that the volumes be measured or estimated and reported on a Form 7 monthly report of production. A new provision is the requirement for an operator to notify the mineral owner of the volume of gas that is flared, vented, or used on lease. This notice is intended to further disincentivize the waste of the resource and also provide additional information to mineral owners regarding the reported volumes of production. Going away from those candlestick flares as shown in the earlier photo, Rule 903D5 requires all flares be enclosed and have 98% design destruction efficiency for hydrocarbons. And that's consistent with Air Pollution Control Division requirements. Now, I'll talk more about pits later in later portions of the 900 series, but in Rule 903D6, we have modified former Rule 805B2C, which dealt with odors from pits close to homes. That rule was originally put in place in several West Slope counties to disincentivize locating pits close to homes where the odors from managing large volumes of produced water is a nuisance. During the 2013 setback rulemaking, the Commission adopted a statewide setback to pits of 1,000 feet and established VOC emissions limits of 5 tons per year to all pits within a quarter mile of a home. Next slide, please. Staff proposes to further strengthen this rule by establishing the 5 tons per year emission limit for all new pits and reducing the emissions limit to 2 tons per year for all pits within 2,000 feet of homes. For each existing pit, operators will have to provide a determination of applicability within a year. For pits greater than 2,000 feet from homes like this one, the Form 4 will be a simple distance to the nearest building unit. But for existing pits within that 2,000 foot zone, the operator will have to provide calculations of uncontrolled actual emissions from the pit. Next slide, please. Moving to Rule 903E, the Commission for the first time will require that operators plan for gas capture during the permitting stage of oil and gas development. The gas capture plan required by Rule 304C12 to be submitted with a Form 2A is described here in 903E. Before I go into the details, I want to re-emphasize a significant change from the earlier draft rules. As described by Director Murphy, this change allows for an applicant to commit on their Form 2A that gas will be captured for sale at commencement of production. Rather than submitting all the details, some of which may not be available at the time of permitting or would be considered confidential, the operator may make the binding commitment to connect to a gathering system. If the operator is not able to commit to gathering, then the operator must submit a gas capture plan. The GCP will describe the operator's compliance with the emissions reduction requirements for drilling, completion, and production, and will include additional information about the availability of gathering system infrastructure, plans to connect or otherwise put the gas to beneficial use, and productivity test or production evaluation information for wildcat wells. In addition to the demonstration of compliance with drilling, completion, and production emissions reduction requirements, there are 4 requirements of gas capture plan that we see as important regardless of the operator's commitment to gathering. They're in bold on this slide. These are a discussion of the safety risks associated with potential escaping gas, a description of the operational best practices to minimize venting during maintenance and repair, procedures planned to reduce the frequency of well liquids unloading events, and a description of how the separation equipment was sized to maximize gas capture. Next slide, please. This slide shows a third-party or midstream gathering system with a centralized compressor station, and the inset shows how the closest wells connect to that system. Operators will provide verification of their compliance with the connection to a gas gathering system on a Form 10 certificate of clearance. As you heard in the 200 series, the Form 10 is required by Rule 219 within 30 days of the initial sale from a well to designate the transporter and gatherer as applicable. If the operator fails to comply with their commitment to gather or the elements of their gas capture plan, Rule 903E3 authorizes the director to require the operator to shut in the well. If the operator disputes this, they may request a hearing before the commission, but the well must remain shut in until the hearing is held. Next slide, please. Rule 903 represents a big step in the Commission's regulatory position with respect to minimizing cumulative impacts of oil and gas development, addressing this industry's contribution to climate change, and the protection of public health. We've worked closely with APCD and our stakeholders to develop a set of rules that complements other regulatory programs, clarifies and strengthens our own regulations on emissions, and is implementable, inspectable, and enforceable on the ground. Although I didn't have any groundbreaking graphics to share with you, I thought this sublime picture of an old pump jack at sunrise would make an adequate substitute, and the photo credit goes to Oil and Gas Location Assessment Specialist Doug Andrews. Next slide, please. Whoops, I guess back a slide, please. So with that, we are happy to take questions on the portions of the 900 series that you've heard about so far. And I would also like to note that Ms. Robin Willey, Chief Strategy Officer for the Air Pollution Control Division, and Ms. Diana Byrne, Eastern Engineering Supervisor here at COGCC, are also with us to field your specific questions. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo. Excellent presentation from all of our staff members. We've been going at this for about an hour and a half, and we've got a lot of good information here. And what I might want to suggest to commissioners is we take a short break and then come back and have questions on these elements before we roll into the other elements. But I'm also looking directly at Director Murphy to see what she thinks would be the best course of action.
I would love 15 minutes to refresh myself before we jump into questions. But
great. If commissioners are okay with that, then it is 10:25. Let's return at 10:40. And then we'll take questions on this initial set of information. The Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission 900 series rulemaking. We heard from staff over the first 3 to 4 sets of rules. And I believe now we have an opportunity to have questions for staff. I just want to give a big props and thank you, Director Murphy, Mr. Leonard, Mr. Duranlo, Mr. Miner, Ms. Larson. Really great presentations this morning. I think one thing of taking a little more time, and we delayed the wildlife, and I think that did give all of us, including staff, the opportunity to put together some really great presentations. I know there was some additional work. An October 20th draft was released. I've talked to folks and feel like we're in a much better place. So thanks everyone for all of that good hard work. And I think that the additional period of time was helpful to all of us for what we're trying to do here. I see that we have everyone on board. Director Murphy, is it okay to launch into questions around 900 to say 903 at this point?
yeah, yes, Chair, I welcome it as the lightning round. We're ready.
All right. Commissioners, who would like to start off? Commissioner Najapa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Murphy and staff for the great presentation. That was really helpful. I had a question related to, let's see, 903D, Part 3. And I just wanted to make sure that I was fully understanding this piece here. So I understand that this is specifically for those existing wells that are not connected to a gathering line or other, or where the venting or flaring is for other beneficial use. I believe in the SBP, it said that there is a year for operators to apply for or to submit, a Form 4 that indicates intent for up to 12 months of additional flaring while they get a gas capture line in place. Is that correct? And I was also then wondering if there was a reason that date or the 1 year, at least I didn't think I saw it in the rule itself.
Chairman, I can take a shot at this question.
Mr. Duranlo.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Commissioner. And the rule states that the Form 4 should be submitted by the effective date of these rules to request that 12-month period of time in which operators would then evaluate their operations and determine what they can do. So it allows the 12-month period that is allowed under an approved Form 4 approved by the director from January 15th, 2021 to January 15th, 2022.
Mr. Geronimo, so what you're saying is that they need to file the Form 4 early on in order to potentially qualify for that one additional year, et cetera. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Commissioner Nanjapa, follow up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, thank you. That helps quite a bit. I think I'll just note, I think that's, at least to me, that was a little bit unclear in the rule that it says, you know, wells that have commenced production prior to January 15th, 2021, but it, at least unless I missed if that was clarified elsewhere, that the Form 4 indicating that intent would need to be submitted by that date also. And then I think that answers another piece of my question. And I believe the SBP also did indicate that there is an opportunity to submit through a variance process an extension request. Is that correct? Would they, if they did not submit an extension request by that 1 year time frame, are they able to request after that 1 year time frame? So by January 15th, 2022? If they have not by then, can they submit after that, or is it at that point it's no longer possible to request the venting and flaring option?
AG Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Commissioner Nanjapa, I think there are two answers to your question. So if an operator does not comply with the 12-month period, so I suppose that would be 12 months from the date that the Form 4 is approved, assuming staff approve it. So that would be likely sometime in late January 2022. The operator would need to cease routine venting and flaring by that date, and otherwise they would be in violation of Rule 903D1, which prohibits that routine venting and flaring. If the operator does, for some reason, encounter an unexpected difficulty that requires an extension of that period, they as you noted, would need to request a variance pursuant to Rule 502, as is the case for all of the Commission's rules. Certainly the operator would be advised to do so in sufficient time to allow a Commission hearing on that variance prior to the date of their 12-month period ending. There's no sort of administrative extension allowed under the rules. So hopefully the operator, if there is some sort of unexpected construction issue, would know about that in time to submit a timely hearing application, and Ms. Larson could speak to sort of exactly what that timeframe would be. In terms of your question of what about sort of what happens after that 1 year period? So any well that is currently venting and flaring, for example, we can think about the wells in areas that don't have sufficient or any gathering line infrastructure. Jackson County comes up a lot. Those wells are already subject to a Form 4 that they have to submit under current Rule 912. They are already requesting permission to vent and flare. So the staff has a good handle on what those wells are, and those will obviously need to submit their Form 4 by January 15th of 2021, as Mr. Geronimo mentioned. However, it's certainly possible that there are other wells, right, that could perhaps lose gathering line connection in the future. Mr. Geronimo used the example of the Third Creek system that in 2018 stopped providing service to connected operators. So if this ever happens in the future, this rule would still apply. The sort of 1 year period the operator would need to submit a Form 4 when they lose gathering line capacity at whatever wells those are, and correct the issue within a year. So this is an ongoing rule for wells that lose gathering line connection in the future, that are existing wells, but sort of the primary intent is to address those wells that are currently venting and flaring.
Okay. Thank you very much, AAG Minor. That answers my questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a follow-up on that one. So understanding that that the 12-month is a one-time option. Is there contemplated situations where a midstream company or a gathering company may not be able to provide capacity more than once? And would they then be allowed to submit this Form 4 request more than one time? Or how would that one time be interpreted in those kind of unforeseen circumstances?
Mr. Geraldo?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Messner, for the question. Staff definitely evaluated that. I think we heard that concern from stakeholders, and we really feel that that is, the 1% of cases. It's not likely for, a gathering system to shut down, a new solution to be to come into place, and then that solution be shut down as well. But again, as AAG Minor mentioned, that gets into the variance provision. And so truly the operator, if they're faced with that situation, could come to the commission and say, look, it happened again, and request relief in that way.
Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that. I mean, I acknowledge that that's would be a very unique situation, but that makes sense that the utilization of the variance process would come into play, and so thanks for that. Just as a general question and more as an informational piece, I understood that within the existing draft rules there is, essentially a prohibition of flaring and venting in production operations, with some limited exceptions. But there is some allowance in different elements of pre-production. And I think some people have questions as far as what kind of timelines do we typically see in pre-production where the venting and flaring may be allowed. So is it a couple months? Is it a couple weeks? Is it a couple years? Generally, and then I know it's site specific and basin specific, but I think there has been some questions as far as what does that look like as far as that pre-production, opportunity to, flare gas that may not be pipeline quality or for operational reasons and completions or pre-production activities.
Mr. Leonard?
Yes, thank you. Typically, it's a short period of time. The less than 2 weeks per well is the typical flowback. A lot of times it's even less than that. And with the new hybrid design of flowback, where everything's just going into the pipeline and going to a central facility, the flaring's been eliminated on site. The completion activity, that's 3 to 4 days a well to get the plugs drilled out. The flaring has to occur there because you can't route the gas back and forth.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much for that. And one other question, and this is just kind of a broad question again, and I do appreciate and acknowledge and understand the different interactions that are happening in the 900 series and in the development of these rules between CDPHE and COGCC, and incorporating the Water Quality Control Commission and the Air Quality Control Commission and the Air Pollution Control Division. I'm kind of wondering how the Colorado Energy Office plays into this as well, particularly around the CHG roadmap and where that plays into the different discussions that are happening. And I do notice, I think that Commissioner Bogue may not be here right now, so that may be a better question to wait on. But I was just curious about that as far as how that plays into the whole conversation.
Director Murphy?
Thank you, Chair. I may start and would offer up or volunteer Commissioner Putnam if he wants to chime in as well. I, as Director of COGCC, don't have very many direct interactions with the Energy Office. I think that the Energy Office is working through the Governor's Office and with different departments, including the Department of Natural Resources, to work on the roadmap. Apologies. Yeah, Walter's very excited about the Energy Office. So, with that, I would say we're working closely to support CDPHE in that space, and we'll work as called upon. And with that, Commissioner Putnam, do you want to chime in with actual specifics?
Thank you, Director Murphy. And like Walter, I'm very excited about the Colorado Energy Office, and am in communication with them almost every day. And so, big picture, Commissioner Messner, on kind of how things will move forward. The Energy Office has been taking the lead in putting together the greenhouse gas roadmap, but relied on the Air Pollution Control Division at CDPHE for a lot of the estimates and kind of way forward in the oil and gas space. And as we move forward, the Air Quality Control Commission and the Air Pollution Control Division will be taking the lead in tracking inventories, tracking the trajectory against the House Bill 19-1261 greenhouse gas emissions targets. One critical development just on Friday was that the Air Quality Control Commission adopted a resolution setting sectoral caps that we'll use to guide rulemaking and also track progress against. The numbers are waiting kind of finalization of the roadmap, which should occur late next month or early in December. But all of that should be buttoned up here soon. I'm waiting for a final version of that resolution, pending a couple changes that the commission made, and I'll send that around to all of you as soon as we have it. But I think with that, CDPHE is going to be primarily in the lead on the kind of tracking and implementation, and both through our process, and that resolution directs the division to communicate with other parts of the state, including this commission, as well as the proposed Rule 904. We'll have a structure for regular two-way conversations to track exactly where we are with that, and really integrate our staff work, our commission work, and a transparent understanding of how we're doing against the targets that are being set.
Great, thank you very much.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question related to 904 and the CIDR database, and kind of relates to some of these pieces from CDPHE. How is that information going to be put into the CIDR data repository, or is it going to be sort of more of an additional piece of information that gets evaluated with what you have in your data repository? Just trying to find out, is that sort of something that's going to be pulled in, real time at the time of an evaluation of this repository information, or is it something that will be sort of collected as it comes, or is it more of like a static evaluation process at a point in time, and then at that point in time you gather the most recent information?
Director Murphy.
Thank you. And Commissioner Nanjapa, if I misanswer, it's because I didn't understand. So bear with me. I think it's a great question. And we to date haven't found a way to perfectly sync COGCC's database with CDPHE's different data gathering tools and pieces. I would say that I'm thinking hard about how to do it, but obviously it's complicated, right? And so I know on one level, we will be getting data into CIDR that staff will be looking at and preparing a report to commissioners about what just came into CIDR. In terms of comparing what we receive in CIDR to what CDPHE receives, that's kind of an ongoing conversation, I would say, about how to do that best. And I think as we build out the forms, as COGCC builds out its forms to collect the CIDR database, collect CIDR data, it will help us better understand how we can compare, contrast, and try to avoid comparing apples to oranges when we're looking at data that's come into CDPHE. But I think that there is kind of an intuitive understanding that what we want to collect through CIDR should complement or inform what CDPHE is collecting. So that's my first cut at an answer, and I hope that helps. And please ask follow-up questions if I haven't addressed the entirety or any of your question.
Mr.
Mr. Chair, if I might, Commissioner Najapa, that's a great question. And just to add on to Director Murphy's point, it is an area where CDPHE and COGCC staff are working together to try to figure out the IT and other sort of elements for how we actually integrate some of the data that we're collecting. CDPHE will be collecting data on actual emissions, COGCC on projected emissions that are coming from OGDPs. And so, we're working through that, but to reinforce, I think the vision is to have an integrated set of information that both agencies can use to inform their decision making and also be available to the public in a transparent way to understand all of this information and how we're doing and where we need to improve in terms of trajectory moving forward.
Commissioner Najapa, follow up, and then Commissioner McGowan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Director Murphy and Commissioner Putnam. That does answer the question. I was just kind of curious if there was discussion or intent to perhaps not right away, but at some point in the future, allow for those databases to talk more directly to each other, and maybe allow for that data to be pulled in, at the click of a button or something. I know that technology is possible, but it's obviously, definitely beyond anything that I fully understand, but appreciate that there are those ongoing discussions and that we're very early in this process. And so I just wanted to understand kind of where the thinking was at the moment. So thank you.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm very appreciative of us kind of fleshing this out and making all these connections to evaluating or assessing and then taking some sort of action. And I still feel like, and I realize that this is a work in progress, and maybe we'll need some sort of a working group. And I realize that staff is talking together, and I don't know if that's the working group or a commissioner or two is involved or some stakeholders are involved to talk about how these pieces are all going to come together so that whatever report is coming out, and I assume that the Air Quality Control Commission is interested in this issue as well, as far as what's actually being emitted, what we're estimating is going to be emitted in the future, and tying it to the roadmap and the goals that we have for each of the sectors. I know that we have this kind of other layer around non-attainment for ozone in the non-attainment area, and I assume that that would be a part of the discussion as well. And so I'm very supportive of this concept and putting all these pieces together. And I just want to make sure that there's a way for us to stay up to date on how that's going to actually come together and what that's going to look like so everybody knows what the expectations are. And so I'm just wondering if we could talk about that as we keep moving forward. And then still in the vein of 904, I'm also appreciative that we took out air emissions from the title of evaluating cumulative impacts because as I have discussed with Director Murphy, I'm also very interested in looking at cumulative impacts for water. And I know in different parts of the series, we are focused on gathering different kinds of data around water quality and I think water quantity and then information about recycling and reuse. And I think that that would be something important for the commission to track on some sort of basis so that we know how much water is being used or reused, what is the quality of that water, so that we have some sort of assessment of cumulative impact from oil and gas activities. I don't know what that looks like, but I would like to put that out there. And I think that there's room for that now that the title of 904 has changed and we have 904A5, where we can look at future rulemakings and cumulative impacts. And then tied to that, I think there's probably hopefully room for us to look at wildlife cumulative impacts. And I don't know what that looks like, but we're gonna have all these maps. We're gonna be keeping track of where activity is taking place. So I'm just wanna make sure that there's space for those two pieces as well.
Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the question, Commissioner. I think on the wildlife piece, I would start with looking at kind of acreages disturbed. That's some of the information that we wanted to track as part of the CIDR database to help us coordinate with CPW on wildlife impacts. And so it's a little bit inferential, but with that direction, I think we can add a note to the SPP that staff should be looking at the CIDR data that's wildlife specific, kind of in the context of wildlife maps and in coordination with CPW. Because I think the structure is there, but maybe not the specificity. And then on the water piece, you know, we did do quite a bit in response to commissioner questions in the 300 series around a better consideration and awareness of water usage. And, you know, staff can take a look at that. And if the commission wants us to start working on language around a 904A water component, that's in addition to what we can do that. Because I think that the data that we're gathering through CIDR on water maybe isn't as precise, and we could look to the data being gathered on the Form 31 or 431, sorry, the Form 5 and 5As, and as it relates to Rule 431. Sorry, I kind of muddled all that together, but if that's something that commissioners are interested in, staff can certainly work on that.
And Mr. Chair, if I might.
Yes, Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner McGowan, for your question. Just to follow up a little bit, just from a CDPHE perspective on how we're kind of seeing how some of that ongoing conversation between the two commissions and the two staffs will work. First, when we had our AQCC meeting last Thursday and Friday, they were very much interested in seeing if we can find a time for the two commissions to meet to discuss some of these issues, knowing that there's you know, a good deal of overlap and a great deal of shared interest in moving forward. And both of us have been changing regulations and need to make sure that we're you know, well up to date on where we're going. On a kind of regular basis, the resolution that I referenced that the commission passed will set up a process where every August, the Air Pollution Control Division will be reporting to the Air Pollution Control Commission, but also to other commissions regarding the kind of inventories that we have for this and other sectors of emissions of greenhouse gases, forecasts and whether there are significant updates to the forecasts and how things go forward, especially for more potentially volatile sectors like oil and gas and transportation, and then to consider whether any changes need to be made in light of that to stay on target for the trajectories to meet the emissions reduction targets in House Bill 1261. So as part of that, it will create a transparent process where we're reporting to the Air Quality Control Commission, to COGCC, to the general public, that information. We will also have the annual information that are coming from our Regulation 7, which has detailed emissions inventories from reporters. We're still trying to figure out the IT and how quickly we can compile that information as opposed to just having it kind of report by report, and that's an ongoing process. But there will be a rich annual source of data that we can all consider. In addition, the Air Quality Control Commission asked the division to prepare a dashboard where on a at least quarterly and often monthly basis, we can look at major trends, production of oil and gas, rig count, those sorts of things, so that we can see if there are big swings or big changes you know, that require a more immediate discussion or conversation about whether that affects the trajectory we're on and the kind of management approach that we're taking to it. That can also be available to this commission. It'll be public. It's largely data we already collect, but we're trying to put it in a more useful format so that people can see a number of those indicators in one place that will be relevant to the state's greenhouse gas planning and implementation, you know, which is shared between this commission and the Air Quality Control Commission, as well as other departments in the state.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Messner, followed by Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner McGowan, if you've got a follow-up to this line, then okay. Then I'm going to go on a different topic here. There was quite a bit of stakeholder or party comment, public comment around pits, particularly the fencing and netting or utilization of the water that's within those pits in different parts of the state. I've asked questions directly to staff around that, and so I feel pretty comfortable with it. But I think that the answers that I got from staff were really helpful as far as the different utilizations of pits around the state, the different quality of liquid that's within those pits. And I guess I'd like to just hear a little bit more about how the approach that's being contemplated within this draft helps alleviate, I think, some of the concerns that some of the stakeholders and parties brought forward in their initial submittals. So I don't know if that was a question or not.
Mr. Geronimo did unmute himself, so perhaps he has an answer.
I'll take it as a question. Mostly, I will kind of defer the question to the next topic that we'll be talking about today. That said, I will say with respect to the emissions component of pits, you will hear later, and you already heard from Director Murphy about the water quality analysis required for pits. And that water quality analysis will really help speak to the emissions potential for all the pits in the state. So that will be kind of those different rules will mesh together on that. But we will go into sort of different pit types and uses in the next segment.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Geronimo. Commissioner McGowan?
Commissioner Messner was heading right where I was heading. I had a different question about pits, and I'm a little unsure how or why we're allowing 5 tons per year of emissions versus 2 tons per year and distances from buildings, and I'm wondering if staff could explain that a little bit, if I'm understanding the rule.
Mr. Geronimo?
Sure, I'll start with that. And our current rule expanded the pit requirement or the emissions restriction to that currently exists within a quarter mile of homes to a statewide requirement. And then we ratcheted that down for pits that are close to homes, and we use the 2,000-foot distance to be consistent with our other rule requirements. And 2 tons per year also is consistent with Air Pollution Control or Air Quality Control Commission requirements for tank emissions. That said, the 5 tons per year was really originally put in place in 2009 to make sure that we had adequate odor control around folks, but it has seemed to be a sort of an appropriate standard to set for those pits statewide. And I don't know, AAG Minor, if you want to help me out there, that would be appreciated.
AAG Minor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think I just want to sort of underscore a couple points. One is that this is the reason that if you look in the statement of basis and purpose, it discusses that there are multiple independent legal bases and thus reasons why the commission would want to regulate emissions, essentially, when we're thinking about pits. There are the public welfare impacts in terms of the odors, and also public health impacts from exposure to volatile organic compounds and hazardous air pollutants that have known health risks. And that is why it makes sense to have a lower emission standard closer to occupied areas, right, using the same 2,000 feet we've seen elsewhere. But those are not the only risks posed by emissions from pits, and some of the compounds that volatilize off the pits are greenhouse gases, right? If we think about the methane content, and also VOCs that contribute to regional ozone issues. So it is important to control those emissions for other public health reasons as well, though those are sort of less based on proximity and more based on overall emissions. I do think that this is kind of standard with, as Mr. Dronlo said, the sort of permitting threshold that is used by the Air Quality Control Commission of 2 tons per year that I believe applies to storage tanks. So sort of below that level, AQCC doesn't necessarily require a permit. And so that seemed to be a reasonable lower bounds that is also based on staff's experience, somewhat lower than the current rules, while the current Rule 805 standard of 5 tons per year seemed to be a workable standard and thus reasonable to employ on a more statewide basis where there were not those specific public health risks. So I would also add we are lucky enough to have Ms. Robin Woolley with us. So if there are sort of follow-up questions on how that lower bound permitting threshold works for the AQCC, I'm sure she would be able to answer them as well.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So sorry, just to clarify, we're doing it from distance of where people live, but we're not looking, while we know that VOC release in the non-attainment area is a concern, we're not really saying 2 tons or 2 tons if you're in the non-attainment area. We're doing it just based on distance to a residence or place where people reside.
AG Minor.
That's correct, Commissioner McGowan, and I think that reflects perhaps 2 on-the-ground realities that maybe are not as obvious from the regulatory text. And one is the fairly limited use of pits within the non-attainment area. It's my understanding, and Mr. Dronlo or Mr. Leonard or Ms. Byrne could explain more, that pits are actually not a very common sort of structure within the Denver-Julesburg Basin, which is the ozone non-attainment area in large part. And second, that is a fairly populated area as well. So probably most pits in the area would likely be subject to emission controls anyway. And I also think that when we get down to that sort of granular level of thinking, in some ways that is better for the Air Quality Control Commission because there are multiple options to reduce emissions from pits, but some involve different choices around E&P waste management techniques, and some but not all of those choices could result in increased truck traffic, which of course has other forms of emissions such as nitrogen oxides that also contribute to ozone formation in a different way. So I think that for those 3 reasons, staff thinks it's probably an appropriate balance to leave the 5 tons per year VOC emissions limit statewide, recognizing that there are sort of special reasons to be concerned in areas that are currently in ozone non-attainment.
And if I may follow up on that just briefly.
Yes, Mr. Dronlo.
Thank you. Regarding the presence of pits here in the DJ Basin, there certainly are pits associated more typically with D&J sand producing wells and older wells, and the pits themselves are older as well. So they've been phased out, as the new horizontal development has come through, that has helped phase them out. But there are pits in, eastern Adams, eastern Arapahoe counties, and portions of Weld County. So it's not to say that they're not there. I think the point that most of them will find themselves, within proximity to people is probably more reflective of what's on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Dronlo. Other questions from commissioners for this panel? Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I'm going back to my initial question just to seek another clarification. So as we discussed on that 903 D3 with existing wells that are venting or flaring and are not connected to the gas gathering lines. So again, just making sure I'm really clear on this. So operators must submit a Form 4 that indicates they need to do some additional flaring. They must submit that before these rules go into effect, which as of now is January 15th of 2021. Is that part correct so far? Yes. Yeah. Okay. AG Minor nodding his head. Okay. And then they have 12 months then to conduct their flaring as needed. So in other words, if they would submit that form this December, it would be through December of 2021 that they would have, or is it from the date of approval?
AAG Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, so I do want to say, and Ms. Byrne could speak to this more, it's important to note that these wells have already submitted Form 4s to allow them to vent and flare under current Rule 912. So they would essentially need to update that form. They could not do so prior to January 15th, right? Or at least the form couldn't be approved prior to January 15th because the new rules will not be in effect yet, but hopefully they do so quite promptly, and I'm sure staff will make sure that those forms are available and sort of provide the appropriate guidance in the timeline for submission. So I do think that the date would of course, the 12 months would run from the date of approval of the Form 4, because of course, staff might not approve all of the Form 4s. And it will need to evaluate the information that is reviewed. And should staff approve the Form 4, that would allow the continued venting and flaring for 12 months from the date of that approval.
Okay. Thank you very much, AG Minor. If I may continue the quick follow-up. So I think in the SBP, I think there was, sorry, I just lost that spot. So, okay, if they through a variance process request an extension, it would be a one-time request. And then that would be, let's see, it says after the end of the 12-month period, wells that have been subject to a 12-month flaring or venting exception may flare or vent for any of the reasons set forth in 903D1A through E without submitting a variance. That's for all of those. Those are the reasons that are already this sort of exceptions. Is that correct? So it's not that they can continue venting or flaring beyond that. The extension that they're granted, and the extension would have an end date on it. Is that correct?
AAG Minor.
Yes, so that is correct. So the extension would presumably have a 12-month end date, right? I suppose, and again, Ms. Byrne is the person who processes many of these, so she could speak to it in more detail. She might, on a case-by-case basis, perhaps determine that less than 12 months is appropriate. For example, if an operator is very nearly connected to a gathering line and all signs show that the construction will be completed by June, there's no reason to extend that beyond June. So she will obviously evaluate every venting and flaring request, as will our other engineering supervisors for other regions on a case-by-case basis to come to the correct conclusion. But most likely it will be for a 12-month period. And I think that would essentially be a condition of approval on the Form 4, sort of identifying the date. In terms of the sort of question of how does 903D3 relate to 903D1, I think this all highlights that perhaps staff, we could have been a little clearer in the statement of basis and purpose, and we can certainly revisit ways to provide additional clarity. The language you mentioned, as you are correct, is to recognize that the 903D1 exceptions do apply to all wells. Both those that are not currently connected to a gathering line and those that are. The exceptions to 903D1 subparts A through E are each situations that are always allowable venting or flaring, right? All wells have to conduct a Braden head test once a year. That will always be permissible regardless of whether that well is currently connected to a gathering line. The reason that is limited to 903D1A through E and not F is that F is the exception in 903D1 that is this sort of allowable one-time extension. So that is to be clear that is not a sort of roundabout way of allowing a second extension. That is saying that those generally applicable standards do apply to wells that are not currently connected to gathering lines as well as those that are.
Mr. Nanjapa.
Thank you. Thank you, AG Minor. And yeah, okay, so then if the Form 4 had been submitted and approved, let's say by February 1st of 2021, then since the rules go into effect and this would be after that date, is so that is a possible scenario. And then during that time frame, they the operator recognizes they need additional time, they can put in for that request through the variance process, and that would at maximum be an additional 12 months. You noted the potential that it would be less than in some cases, but it would be at maximum another 12 months. So in theory, within about 2 years from the rules going into effect, this practice would be sunsetted.
AG Minor?
That's perhaps not quite correct, Commissioner Nanjapa, and the answer is it's up to you. So there is a one-time staff-approved 12-month extension allowed under the rules. So I would say perhaps the most appropriate way to characterize the rules is that they end, the proposed rules would end routine venting and flaring within a year. As with all of the Commission's rules, though, the option of a variance exists. And so an operator for some reason is not able to comply with the rules during the first year that they have to end routine venting and flaring, they always could come to the Commission and ask for a variance, and that would be up to the Commission to determine whether it's appropriate on a case-by-case basis, applying all of the fairly rigorous standards in Rule 502. I think, as I believe Mr. Leonard or perhaps Mr. Dronlow mentioned earlier, there are sort of different situations where there are wells that are currently not connected to a gathering line, and you can imagine different scenarios for each of them, right? So those that are just in a field that doesn't have gathering capacity right now, North Park is what everyone uses as the example, and I think it's probably the best example. They have a year to construct that gathering line, but as we know, there are fires going on in that area. Construction season is sometimes limited. So perhaps there will be an unforeseen and sort of unpreventable delay in construction. That might be a reason for that variance, but it's not contemplated in the rules. I think the wells that are sort of very old wells in the Florence field down in Fremont County, those are perhaps a different situation where the extremely minimal amount of venting compared to sort of the adverse impacts that might result from trying to control that venting might result in an operator coming to the Commission and asking for perhaps even a lifetime variance. I don't want to sort of predict the future there, but the Commission might look at that a little bit differently. And so ultimately, though, the decision is yours on whether any variances would be granted. And that's essentially what Rule 903D1 does, is it elevates what's currently a staff level decision under Rule 912 to the Commission at the end of a year, saying that this is a serious issue that staff believes the Commission should be the deciders on now that we have a full-time Commission after that first one-year extension.
Thank you very much, AAG Minor. That's very helpful.
AAG Minor, if I could follow up on that line of questioning. So the D3 one-time exception, that is, staff has determined that is appropriately a director decision as opposed to a Commission decision? Or is it a director decision that then is the Commission sanctions?
Mr. Chair, that is a staff decision. So it's director approval of the Form 4. That is consistent with current Rule 912. Again, Ms. Byrne and Mr. Berger and Ms. McCoy and all of our engineering team are currently reviewing those applications under 912, which are also filed through Form 4 sundry notices. So the idea is sort of have a final continuation of that current staff level review, and after that, simply not allow future routine venting and flaring. And should an operator ever seek to do so, they would need to file an application for hearing with the Commission for variance under Rule 503G.
Thank you for that clarification. Other questions for commissioners? Or, I'm sorry, for staff from commissioners? All right, excellent presentation and good Q&A. I think that was helpful to the process. Director Murphy, do we want to launch into the next area of staff approach for us this morning?
Yes, please, and be prepared for a quick shift. But Mr. Dronlow, do you want to jump in?
Yes, indeed. Can we please bring up our presentation again? And we can move off of the sublime picture of the pump jacket sunrise. Here's the world's fastest recap of the presentation you just saw. And thank you, Ms. Amaro, for bringing that up. Welcome back, commissioners. Thank you again for the opportunity to present. Before we get started, I want to reintroduce you to the environmental group, which consists of 16 environmental protection specialists, 12 of whom are regionally assigned to specific geographic areas, as you can see here. The team is responsible for overseeing exploration and production waste management activities and spill and release investigation and cleanup. In other words, we implement the 900 series rules. This team has years of both regulatory and private sector experience as environmental consultants and professionals, and has been driving positive change with the oil and gas operational practices to reduce the negative environmental legacy of the industry for much longer than I've been here. This team is responsible for ensuring that when an oil and gas location is closed, the operator does not leave behind a mess for someone else to clean up. I'm proud and fortunate to have the opportunity to lead this group of amazing professionals as its manager. The changes to the 900 series that I and John Axelson, Eastern Colorado Supervisor, will be talking about are significant. They represent the collective experience of the environmental group obtained over the years of implementing our rules and working with operators to achieve compliance, protect the environment, and avoid impacts. So often, the environmental unit is called upon to oversee the cleanup of waste, and our staff can't help but see that the mess could have been prevented. Our changes to these rules opportunistically and precisely take advantage of our knowledge and experience to better avoid environmental impacts in the first place. Next slide, please. Before I get into the rule changes, I want to address a couple of overarching concepts that you'll hear again and again, and have already heard some today. First, exploration and production waste, or E&P waste, is something that you will hear a lot about in the 900 series. E&P waste is specifically exempted from RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, due to its properties and pedigree. RCRA is the federal law that governs all aspects of hazardous and non-hazardous solid waste management through subtitles C and D, respectively. Our partners in the Hazardous Materials and Waste Management Division at CDPHE implement RCRA and solid waste regulations for all waste besides those classified as E&P. The authority over E&P waste is statutorily granted to the COGCC. The RCRA exemption for E&P waste does not mean that the wastes do not have hazardous properties, and it does not mean that they are unregulated. But the exemption was established due to the high volumes of waste with relatively low hazard properties that are generated during exploration and production activities. Examples of these types of wastes are drill cuttings, drilling mud, produced water, and soil impacted by the previous materials. These wastes are all brought to the surface from downhole and are subject to COGCC regulation. One advantage to waste management that results from this exemption is the ability to dispose of waste at the site from which it was generated. This reduces the expense and associated impact of transportation. For produced water, that E&P waste may be disposed down a Class 2 UIC well, as you have discussed during the 800 series rulemaking. The COGCC has been delegated as an implementing agency for the groundwater standards and classifications established by the Water Quality Control Commission. As explained earlier by AAG Minor, this authority is granted in the Water Quality Control Act and was established with Senate Bill 89-181, the original 181. These 900 series rules strengthen our implementation of that authority and also address potential surface water impacts from oil and gas operations. And as with our efforts to reduce the waste of the resources, the proposed 900 series emphasize proper planning of oil and gas operations to avoid and minimize potential impacts from the generation and management of exploration and production waste. From the requirement for a waste management plan to be developed for each new site to the requirement for every new pit, regardless of pit type, to be permitted, The 900 series rewards operators who create and implement comprehensive plans for their waste stream. When properly managed, E&P waste can be generated and disposed without significant harm to the environment. Next slide, please. Rule 905 outlines and identifies specific E&P wastes and provides the methods that are allowed to properly treat or dispose of these wastes. Broadly, the categories of waste covered include produced water, drilling fluids, drill cuttings, oily waste, other E&P waste, and non-E&P waste. Rule 905A3 expands the reach of current rules related to reuse and recycling plans. The COGCC continues to support efforts to reduce the overall reliance on freshwater resources, and the ability to reuse and recycle produced water is central to that effort. Many stakeholders requested that we make a requirement that all produced water be recycled. Although some 90% of water used for drilling and completion in the Piceance Basin is reused at least once, it is not realistic to presume that that model works everywhere, every time. Not all operators have active drilling operations that would allow them to reuse produced water. And nonetheless, there is a great progress by many operators recycling and reusing produced water in their operations. Generally, water reuse and recycling is limited to oil and gas operations, such as for drilling fluids, completion fluids, or tertiary recovery projects. Reuse of produced water outside of oil and gas operations has not been done in Colorado, though it's been discussed a great deal, and there are significant legal hurdles to doing so. Rule 905A4 requires a waste management plan for all new locations. Many operators have such plans and programs and keep them up to date and implement them. The basis for this rule is that all operators who are going to generate waste from their operations in the state need to have a plan in place identifying the different waste streams and the appropriate management and disposal methods before creating the waste. The waste management plan should also include training programs for employees to make sure it's implemented. Rule 905A5, which clarifies remediation obligations for active and closed oil and gas locations and remediation projects, was already discussed this morning by AAG Minor, so I'm not going to go into it again here. Rule 905B carries forward our current waste transportation requirements, but now cross-references the Rocky Mountain Low-Level Radioactive Waste Compact, which is a regulatory organization under federal and state law covering Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico for the regulation of interstate transportation and disposal of low-level radioactive waste. Rule 905C covers produced water. There are 5 methods allowed for produced water disposal. They include injection into a Class II UIC well, evaporation or percolation in a properly permitted pit, disposal at a commercial disposal facility permitted and regulated by CDPHE, discharge to surface water under a CDPHE issued discharge permit, or evaporation from a pit at a centralized E&P waste management facility. Regarding the surface discharge as a disposal option, these discharges are permitted under the Clean Water Act by CDPHE. The rules require that the operator provide the permit number, location of the outfall, and the source of the produced water. The rules also state that the discharge may not flow overland to reach the receiving waters. Rule 905C5 provides for the execution of water sharing agreements between operators. The rule codifies an existing practice of allowing these agreements to be used for water management. The rule requires submittal of the water sharing plan to allow staff to consider issues such as conveyance of water between operators, associated facilities, and responsible parties for spill or release cleanup. These sharing agreements have been beneficial to operators, especially on the West Slope, where transportation costs can be very high, and these agreements encourage recycling and reuse of the produced water. Next slide, please. Operators can discharge into waters of the state under an approved permit issued by Water Quality Control Division, as I mentioned. Rule 905C2D Romanet 2 was added to prevent erosion and contamination from these discharges between the outfall and the receiving body of water. This image shows the damage caused by saline water discharged over the land surface for years. While the discharged water may have eventually reached the receiving water, it left quite a mess in between. Therefore, the rule now requires that water be discharged at the actual receiving water, and if the source is some distance away, that it be conveyed to the receiving water in a manner that does no harm. Next slide, please. So bear with me as I go through this slide because there's a lot here, and then I'll come back with some pictures to illustrate some of the points. Starting at the top, Rule 905D enhanced the requirements for land application of bentonitic fluids generated during drilling operations. Just as a refresher, drilling fluids or mud are used to cool and lubricate the drill bit, seal the wellbore, control downhole pressures during drilling, and convey the cuttings to the surface. Generally, there are three types of drilling fluids: water-based or bentonitic, oil-based, also known as OBM, oil-based mud, and salt-based. Water-based mud consists of water as a base fluid with bentonite and other minerals used to develop the weight of the mud. These fluids are relatively benign as bentonite is just clay, and these drilling fluids are used during the drilling of the surface casing through freshwater aquifers, even if oil-based mud will be used in the hole below. Oil-based mud can be made with petroleum or synthetic-based fluids, and due to its properties, reduces friction, torque, and drag, allowing for more complex wellbore geometries and longer horizontal laterals. Oil-based muds are also more compatible with hydrocarbon-bearing formations, but they do have hazardous properties and must be managed properly in order to avoid environmental impacts. Salt-based muds are used in a few basins in Colorado, and like the name implies, they use salt to build the necessary properties of the mud, often called brine. There are technical reasons to use these saline fluids, and again, fluids management is critical with these in order to prevent impacts. In the past, drilling fluids were most commonly evaporated off of a drilling pit or hauled to a UIC well. However, they do have the potential to clog UIC wells, and so that method is not commonly used for disposal. With the significant shift towards closed loop or pitless drilling systems, the ability to evaporate these fluids has diminished as well. Rule 905D3B provides the operator with the ability to put spent water-based bentonitic drilling fluids to beneficial use as a soil amendment under certain conditions. If approved by the director on a waste management plan and the fluids meet the standards set in Table 915.1, the operator may utilize land application as a method of disposal, but only for water-based mud. For clarity, we've revised the definitions of land application and land treatment. Our new definitions make it clear that land application is a method of disposal of benign waste, whereas land treatment is the method of contaminant reduction in E&P waste. In the past, there's been much confusion on this, resulting in mismanagement of so-called land farms. For oily waste, we've updated the definition, clarified existing disposal options, and enhanced the requirements for land treatment of oily waste for better environmental protection. For the definition, we've included a direct reference to the hydrocarbon cleanup standards in Table 915.1 to institutionalize the longstanding practice of our environmental protection specialists in making that determination. With respect to land treatment, we've made several changes to the requirement that will ensure environmental protection, including the addition of specific requirements to protect surface and groundwater. We've also established a 3-year time frame for land treatment operations to encourage active enhancement of the natural remediation processes and to discourage long-term management of impacted material. Operators may propose to use more time, but they would then be required to permit the treatment facility as a centralized E&P waste management facility. COGCC made no substantive changes for the requirements for other E&P wastes, as these requirements are generally more limited due to their higher hazard properties of the types of waste considered under this rule. 3 out of the 4 allowable disposal methods include disposal at facilities that are subject to other COGCC or other state agency permitting requirements. And the last method is unspecified, but would require explicit director approval through the waste management plan. In Rule 905G, staff has added drill cuttings to the rules as a category of E&P waste and provides specific options for treatment, management, and disposal. First, many drill cuttings will meet the definition of oily waste and therefore must be handled as such. Once the drill cuttings are treated to meet Table 915.1 concentrations, or if they do so without treatment, the operator may dispose of the cuttings in one of 5 possible ways. They may be disposed at a solid waste disposal facility, a centralized exploration and production waste management facility, through land application as a beneficial soil amendment, in a drilling pit, or in a cuttings trench. Next slide, please. So this slide shows 2 examples of common compliance issues with land treatment of oily waste. On the left, we see that the waste is piled too thick to foster effective bioremediation of hydrocarbons. We see evidence that the waste was placed without removing free liquid oil. We see waste placed too close to a county or close to a county road in a roadside ditch even, with no access control. And we do not see evidence of active tilling, turning, aeration, or microbial enhancement in the piles. On the right, we see where oily waste was spread beyond the boundaries of the oil and gas location into the surrounding cornfields with no agreement from the farmer. This material was not sufficiently treated after 3 years to meet the cleanup standards, so that the land was lost to the farmer for an extended period of time. And when the land treatment is unsuccessful, the soil beneath the treatment area frequently requires treatment of its own or removal, resulting in unnecessary topsoil loss. Next slide, please. So in these 2 examples, we see problems with land application of water-based bentonitic drilling mud. In both photos, there is clear evidence of overloading with waste and a failure to incorporate into native soils. On the left, the fluids have been dumped in thick piles and left to dry. And on the right, while more uniformly spread out, they've not been worked into the soil and were also placed too thick. When placed in this manner, the land application serves no benefit and results in degradation to the surrounding land when it runs off. Additionally, there is no realized benefit when placed on non-crop lands. Next slide, please. However, when done correctly, land application of water-based bentonitic drilling fluids actually does provide a benefit to croplands. By increasing the water holding capacity of the soil, by adding this clay material, farmers have claimed increased crop yield where the amendment has been properly applied. The photo on the left shows a land application site where cuttings have been properly placed and incorporated, and the photo on the right shows crops growing in a similar field after successful land application. Next slide, please. Staff made clarifying changes to former Rule 907 Big A regarding the management of non-E&P waste. The rule primarily reminds operators to comply with the Solid and Hazardous Waste Commission rules for management of solid waste and hazardous materials, which are not subject to the E&P waste management exemption. And next slide, please. Moving on to centralized E&P waste management facilities, this slide shows an example of a centralized E&P waste management facility on the West Slope. These facilities are typically, but not always, large facilities designed and engineered to handle the movement and management of large volumes of E&P waste over long periods of time. They often involve complex waste handling and treatment processes, multiple pits, and specialized process equipment. Centralized E&P waste management facilities are permitted on a Form 28. The Form 28 is really just a cover sheet for the permit application, which typically has information filling 1 or more 3-ring binders. The permits are reviewed by our environmental protection specialists and our engineering unit who review the civil design. The COGCC has a contract with a third-party consultant to review certain aspects of the Form 28, including the proposed financial assurance amount, because these facilities must be bonded in accordance with the 700 series rules with an amount sufficient to cover the entire potential cost to decommission all facilities, remediate any residual impacts following decommissioning, regrade and recontour the land surface, and revegetate and reclaim the area. For large sites like this, the bond amount could be up to $2 million. Next slide, please. So now going through the centralized E&P waste management rules, because of the reorganization of the 900 series, what was Rule 908 governing these facilities is now Rule 907. Because of their inherent complexity, staff is modifying the Form 28 permitting requirements to include a professional engineer or PE certification on the design package. We've improved and clarified the waste profiling requirements, and we've emphasized the local government's role in siting these facilities. Former Rule 908 required the operator to provide approvals from the local government before the final Form 28 was approved. Staff has moved this requirement into the permitting criteria so that the operator must provide evidence that they have complied with local land use regulations, facility siting, construction, and operational requirements on the front end. With respect to the permit review process, staff has proposed a 90-day completeness determination for Form 28 applications. This is consistent with CDPHE's process for reviewing similarly scaled solid waste facilities, and we've revised the approval and denial criteria to align better with the mission change mandate of SB 19-181. Because of the successful management of waste under current Rule 908, staff proposed no significant changes to the requirement for facility design or operations throughout the rest of Rule 907. Next slide, please. Rule 908, 909, and 910 cover pit permitting, construction and operation requirements, and pit lining requirements. Modifications to these rules, formerly found in 902, 903, and 904, represent additional progress towards reducing environmental impacts from routine management of E&P waste. And now, Commissioner Messner, I will get into a couple of types of those pits, and we'll go through some of those operations. So in 2004, as a little backstory, as an environmental consultant, when I first walked into a gas plant office in Jay, Florida, the first thing I noticed was a photo from the early 1970s. It showed an oil executive in a suit and a hard hat, standing on a 24-inch diameter pipe, flowing oil directly into an earthen pit. By the time that photo was taken, Colorado had already prohibited storage of oil in earthen pits, but their use for E&P waste and fluids management continues to this day. COGCC defines 3 general types of pits: drilling, production, and special purpose. And while all are less common today than in the past, all continue to see use in Colorado. For further information on any of the pit types, please refer to our 100 series rules, but I will describe a few pit types in more detail. First, drilling pits are constructed adjacent to a drill rig to manage drilling fluids. Reserve pits are used to mix fresh mud and settle out cuttings before being cycled back into use. Over the last dozen or so years, these pits have become less and less common for a number of reasons, but they continue to be used with smaller rigs where closed loop or pitless infrastructure is not practical. The advantage to using a drilling pit is that the cuttings can be disposed on site in the pit through drying and burial. Production pits, such as the 2 examples on this slide, are used to manage E&P waste during production operations. These pits are typically larger than drilling pits and are in use for the life of the well. Production pits include skim pits, settling pits, produced water pits, percolation pits, and evaporation pits. Production pits are the most common pit type, but again, over the last dozen or so years, new production pits have diminished in number, with less than 100 new production pits permitted since January 2016. And by comparison, there were 117 pits permitted in 2010 alone. The pit on the left is a produced water pit, specifically an evaporation pit. The pit on the right is actually permitted as a skim pit due to the routine presence of oil, although the pit mostly manages produced water. Skim pits are an arcane waste management tool in which water with residual oil are sent to the pits for continued separation. Largely, the use of these pits has been usurped by tanks or better primary or secondary separation. However, some, such as the pit on the right, have been designed to handle routine or occasional fluctuation in production that result in oil bypassing other production equipment and then requiring manual skimming off the pit surface. Special purpose pits are the third class of pits and include blowdown pits, flare pits, emergency pits, basic sediment and tank bottoms pits, workover pits, and plugging pits. These types of pits are uncommonly used. In fact, in the 10 years that I've been here, I've permitted a handful of flare pits, which upon pressing the operators, it turned out that they were designed and permitted, but not actually constructed or used. They were simply a relic of how they used to build their sites. Emergency pits are occasionally constructed as necessary to manage fluids in the case of a large spill, and workover and plugging pits have mostly been replaced by tank systems. Next slide, please. The biggest change to pit permitting requirements in Rule 908A was the addition of drilling pits that need to be permitted with a Form 15. No longer is the permit requirement just for drilling pits for oil-based mud or salt-based mud, but now the requirement applies to all drilling pits, even those using water-based bentonitic fluids. And the Form 15 must be approved in advance of construction of the pit. Rule 908B now requires a Form 15 for enlarging or modifying existing pits, which allows staff to conduct an appropriate environmental review on pits that may have been originally permitted long ago. Consistent with current requirements and practices, a pit report, Form 15, is required within 30 days after construction for emergency pits, plugging pits, and workover pits if they are used in the initial phases of an emergency response. And Rule 908B also requires a pit report for cuttings trenches, which have been previously approved on a Form 2A. Next slide, please. Rule 909A was added to address significant challenges with pit records, both on the operator side and on the agency's side, because accurate records are a critical component of environmental protection when it comes to pits. This issue has come to light more and more over recent years when oil and gas facilities change hands, and this new provision aligns with Rule 218 and our effort to ensure accurate records during facility transfer. Rule 909A places the burden of record keeping directly on the operator responsible for the pit facility. The rule requires that the operator verify that their pit permit or registration information is accurate, that the pit is accurately mapped, and the pit is correctly related to other facilities in the Colorado Oil and Gas Information System, or COGIS database. Next slide, please. This slide shows an example of pit record issues at facilities in Washington County. What you see is a well with remote production facilities, including a series of production pits. The laundry list of things wrong with the records demonstrated here include inaccurate pit location, unknown pit status, discrepancy in the number of pits, unreported significant changes to the pits, incorrect operator of record. What we're trying to accomplish with this rule is to get all facility records to reflect the correct information regarding the current operator, location, status, and related facilities for each pit record in the COGIS database. Next slide, please. This slide shows an improvement in record keeping where the squares on the map are registered pit facilities. Light green are active pits, dark green are closed pits, and the white are pits with unknown status. As you can see, most of the active and closed pits in this area are accurately mapped at the pit location rather than at the well or the center of a quarter section. However, some stragglers do still exist. This area required considerable staff effort to extract the history, status, and location of the numerous pits for which we had partial records. Requiring the operator to initiate the records review will greatly improve the process and will also expedite our review of Form 9s when they are submitted to transfer these facilities. Next slide, please. Staff proposed several significant changes to pit construction and operational requirements. First, consistent with our 1200 series, and as discussed by Director Murphy earlier, we are requiring all new pits to be fenced and netted to prevent impacts to wildlife. However, For existing pits, we are allowing for a case-by-case consideration to determine the necessity of this measure. Many pits pose little risk to wildlife due to their location or water quality, and therefore staff determined that fencing and netting of those pits would be unreasonable and not necessary. But there are other existing pits where, due to water quality or their location relative to migratory corridors, wildlife mortality has already been a factor. And those types of pits should be fenced and netted. Other operational requirements, such as a prohibition on storage of liquid hydrocarbons in pits, minimum requirements for freeboard, and water treatment requirements were carried forward. A significant new rule requirement is Rule 909J, the requirement for operators to obtain an analysis of all produced water being placed into pits. This requirement will help the COGCC and the operator have a better understanding of the overall characterization of the produced water. The information will be used in numerous ways, including to assess the potential threat to wildlife due to toxicity characteristics, to help improve our understanding of how to better clean up spills and releases at the facility. The analysis for total petroleum hydrocarbons and benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, or BTEX, will help operators meet the requirements to estimate emissions from the pits as required and discussed under Rule 903D6. And it will help with compliance required by the new T-norm rules being developed by CDPHE by using radium-226 and 228 results to determine if the produced water can be exempted from the T-norm requirements. And so as a side note, I believe this has been discussed before, but just as a reminder, naturally occurring radioactive material, or NORM, is material that in its natural state in our environment has radioactive properties. An example of NORM is radon, which is a radioactive gas emitted from rocks and which is present in the excavated basements and in groundwater along the Front Range and in the mountain and foothills communities. T-norm is technologically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive material, which by human processes concentrates the radioactive material. An example of T-norm is the pipe scale, which builds up on some fluids handling equipment, where over time, the scale becomes more radioactive than the source material flowing through the equipment. In addition to upstream oil and gas activities, T-norm is produced in waste management operations and midstream oil and gas operations, such as refining or gas treating. Next slide, please. So the produced water quality analysis will be conducted for this list of analytes, and generally we've adjusted various analytical requirements in our rules to create a similar, if not exact, list of analytes. And I realized as Director Murphy gave her introduction to that this slide isn't quite right, because staff did propose a late change in coordination with CDPHE to include total suspended solids in letter C. Next slide, please. The last rule I will be discussing before turning it over to Mr. Axelson is Rule 910. These are the pit lining requirements. The first and most significant change is that we will, from now on, require all new pits to be lined. This effectively eliminates percolation as a disposal method for produced water, thereby ensuring groundwater protection regardless of the site-specific circumstances, including depth to groundwater and groundwater and produced water quality. The second substantive change is the prohibition of new skim pits and the requirements to line existing skim pits. Skim pits have required lining since 2009, but staff believes that there may be a few lingering cases that have not been brought into compliance. This rule, coupled with Rule 908A, the reporting rule, will ensure that these pits are properly addressed. On the left is an example of a skim pit that clearly poses a risk to the environment and to wildlife, and was taken out of service and cleaned up. On the right is an example of a skim pit where the operator elected to retain the use, but built a lined skim pit that is properly fenced and netted to exclude wildlife. Next slide, please. Staff made significant changes in Rule 910 to improve record-keeping requirements for construction and pit liner installation. We clarified that double synthetic liners are appropriate for pits at centralized E&P waste management facilities, and we required leak detection at all such pits. Lastly, These rules broaden staff's discretion to require additional protective measures for pits, including secondary liners with leak detection, as staff analysis determines is necessary for the protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. Next slide, please. And I'll leave you with these pictures of a pit in the Raton Basin in Los Animas County. This unlined pit is for the management and disposal of water produced during coal bed methane development. Due to the geology and the production methods for coal bed methane, the water in a pit like this may be of similar quality to that which is produced by domestic water wells in the area. And this water is commonly discharged to the surface water under a CDPHE issued permit without deleterious effects to the receiving water. The infiltration or percolation of this type of water similarly has no adverse environmental effects on groundwater resources. I'll now turn it over to Mr. John Axelson, the Eastern Environmental Supervisor, to take you through Rules 911 through 915, which address spills, releases, site investigations, remediation projects, and cleanup standards. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo. Excellent presentation. Mr. Axelson, we see you and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. As Mr. Duranlo said, I'm John Axelson, the Eastern Region Environmental Supervisor, and I'm going to continue to present the most significant changes with the 900 series rules, 911 through 915. So broadly speaking, this section of the 900 series rules covers the closure of oil and gas facilities, spill and releases, site investigation and remediation, as well as the appropriate cleanup concentrations for contaminants in soil and groundwater. One of the most important changes is Rule 911, which now requires the submittal of a Form 27 site investigation and remediation work plan for the closure of all oil and gas facilities at the time of final site closure. Next slide, please. In the past, the only time a Form 27 was required for facility closure was when a partially buried vessel was being removed or a pit was being closed. For the past several years, especially along the Front Range, where there's a large amount of development, we've seen an increasing number of locations where residual contamination is discovered at former oil and gas locations. These impacts are often found during grading and excavation for residential and commercial development. In many cases, the operator received closure on their site and received financial assurance, so there is no remaining party responsible to clean the site up. In these pictures, you see a partially buried vessel being removed and another one with an obvious leak. During removal of these tanks, operators often find residual contamination. These can turn into significant cleanups because the leaks are generally below the surface, lasting for extended periods of time. When there isn't a partially buried vessel or a pit on location, there's really no subsurface investigation done to verify that the site is clean. As a result, potential soil and groundwater impacts remain undiscovered. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a tank battery with a partially buried produced water tank. In this case, there was no obvious indication of impacts, and it appeared to be a well-maintained location. Upon removal of the partially buried vessel, although it hadn't leaked, historic soil contamination was discovered. Next slide, please. Here you see the excavation that resulted after the removal of the tank battery equipment. What appeared to be a straightforward facility closure turned into a large soil remediation project. These are the types of situations we're trying to prevent in the future so they don't turn into stranded cleanups that end up in the state orphan well program. In some cases, operators have already been performing assessments at the time of closure of their facilities, but since there wasn't a requirement, they didn't provide them to COGCC. With this new rule, it gives the state assurance that the site does not pose an ongoing threat to the environment from residual contamination. Next slide, please. So moving on to Rule 912, which covers spills and releases. And just a refresher, there's some subtle differences between spills and releases. A spill is defined as any unauthorized sudden discharge of exploration and production waste to the environment. And releases are any unauthorized discharge of exploration and production waste to the environment over time. As an example, a one-time overflow of an oil tank would be considered a spill, while a leaking flow line below the surface over a long period of time would be considered a release. One of the most important jobs of the environmental protection specialists is to follow up on spills and remediations. We generally receive notice of a spill by phone or email, and by rule, the notice is required within 24 hours of discovery. The operator is required to submit a Form 19 spill release report within 72 hours of discovery that includes additional information. When we receive the notification, our environmental protection specialists will generally perform a tabletop review of the spill location, and based on the severity of the spill and potential impacts, will often respond to the field to document conditions and the cleanup activity. During the initial review, they look at factors such as surrounding water wells that could be threatened, the depth to groundwater, nearest surface water, nearest residences, critical wildlife habitat, roads, utility corridors, and land use. Then they may apply conditions of approval to the Form 19 to address and mitigate potential impacts from the spill. So an example of that may be if there's a nearby domestic water well, they would require the operator to collect a sample to make sure there were no impacts to that water well. The environmental protection specialist tracks the spill to closure, making sure that it was properly cleaned up in the field and that the documentation submitted confirms the cleanup. All spill reports and associated documents are received through e-forms and are available to the public from our website. In many cases, the EPS is also communicating and coordinating with not only the operator, but local governments, the surface owner, and other state and federal agencies, depending on the type of the spill. Rule 912B sets the spill reporting thresholds. Based on past experience with compliance issues and as a way to better document certain cleanups that weren't captured in the past, several new reporting thresholds were added. Next slide, please. So reporting thresholds 912B1 A through D were previously required. And I should note that when we discuss spills, we're talking about produced fluids and E&P waste. So spills can be made up of oil, produced water, drilling fluids, flowback, and other types of E&P waste. It's not just oil. So our previous requirements for reporting thresholds were any size of a spill or release that threatens waters of the state, a public byway, livestock, and residences in A. A spill or release of 1 barrel, which is equivalent to 42 gallons outside of containment, 5 barrels or 210 gallons, regardless of whether it's in or out of containment, and a grade 1 gas leak from a flow line. If you're not familiar with a grade 1 gas leak, it means a gas leak that ignites or represents an existing or probable hazard to persons or property and requires immediate repair or continuous action until the conditions are no longer hazardous. So beginning with E are the new reporting thresholds. The discovery of 10 cubic yards or more of impacted material, discovery of impacted waters of the state. Next slide, please. Spills or releases of any volume where the volume cannot immediately be determined or where a spill or release daylights from the subsurface. Hydrocarbon mists that leave the oil and gas location. Natural gas release that results in accumulation of soil gas or gas seeps. And last, a release that results in natural gas in groundwater. Next slide, please. So this slide depicts a calculation that can be used to estimate the amount of soil that might be contaminated by a spill of oil. This is just one example, and depending on the variables you use, there can be many results. What we wanted to represent was how much material would be impacted by a spill of 1 barrel into a fine grain material such as silt, and a coarser grain material such as sand. In the case of a spill of oil into a silty material, we would expect, based on this calculation, 3 cubic yards of material to be impacted. In the case of oil, 1 barrel of oil into sand, we would expect 6.5 cubic yards to be impacted. Instead of setting a lower reporting threshold, we realized that the 10 cubic yards of impacted material often represents 1 dump truck load of waste being removed from a location. Based on the fact that 10 cubic yards likely represents a barrel or more of oil, we chose it as the new reporting threshold. This is an important requirement because in the past, many historic impacts that were not related to current spills weren't reported. Some operators had internal reporting triggers of 10 or even 20 loads of contaminated material being excavated before they would report to us. We believe these cleanups need to be reported and documented. Next slide, please. So in this example of 912B1F, you have oil on surface water on the right and oil on groundwater in the picture in the left. These are now considered a reportable spill. In the past, although EPS staff would have considered this a threat to waters of the state, many such incidents weren't reported until the operator received sample results some days or weeks after the spill. This prevented our staff from being able to respond to the field and observing the conditions of the spill. Our staff believes that when oil or other E&P waste come into contact with surface water or groundwater, it should be reported. Next slide, please. In this example, there's obviously contaminated soil in contact with groundwater. These occurrences now need to be reported regardless of the volume of the release. Next slide. Here's another example where small surface expressions of fluid have daylighted to the surface. In these cases, the operator did not believe they were reportable because they felt that less than 1 barrel of fluid had accumulated at the surface. Quite often, it takes a substantial volume of fluid to work its way to the surface. When these types of releases are discovered, there are often large quantities of impacted material below the surface. In the example on the right, approximately 2,300 cubic yards of material had to be excavated to clean up the subsurface release. Next slide, please. And this is the last example I have of the new reporting thresholds for J. This is where gas is migrating to the surface outside of the casing. So I should note, this is a very rare circumstance. If you look close, you can see bubbles of gas in the standing water around the well casing. In most cases, these type of releases weren't reported to us. We often learned of these problems from the engineering department, then would request a Form 27 remedial investigation from the operator with a plan to determine if there were accumulations of soil gas and or impacts to groundwater. Note that in cases like this, the operator is required to re-enter the well to perform repairs to prevent the migration of gas from the well bore, or in some cases, they would eventually just plug the well to stop the release. Next slide, please. Here are some additional changes to Rule 912. A supplemental Form 19 now needs to include photo documentation of spill release cleanup. There's now a 90-day requirement to either provide documentation in a supplemental Form 19 to receive closure from COGCC, or submit a Form 27 for approval for remediation extending beyond the 90 days. And last, 912B10 requires Colorado Parks and Wildlife notification when spills and releases are within 300 feet of surface waters of the state or within high priority habitat. Next slide. So this slide illustrates that as of October 15th, there were 832 active or unresolved spills in the state. And I need to clarify that when I say active or unresolved, it doesn't mean that the spill wasn't controlled and cleaned up. It often means that the operator just failed to provide follow-up documentation to verify that it was cleaned up. And when they provide this information, it gives us the ability to administratively close the spill. So we're talking really about paperwork problems here. You can see that 42% of these spill reports are aged 5 to 10 years and 25% are over 10 years. Part of this is because in 2014, COGCC environmental staff implemented the E-Form 19, making it easier for operators to submit supplemental cleanup reports, resulting in a smaller number of aging spills from 1 to 5 years, as indicated on the slide. Our goal is to prevent the backlog from growing. Operators will now need to either completely clean the spill up and provide documentation in 90 days, or have a Form 27 submitted with a specific plan for ongoing remediation past 90 days. Next slide. And this slide depicts the amount of time it took to get spills closed over the past 3 years. It represents a total of 1,878 spills with an average time to close of 188 days. Basically, we want that blue area to close and have all spill reports resolved in the 90-day window. Next slide. So moving on to Rule 913. So Rule 913 provides the regulatory framework for site investigations, remediation, and closure. The biggest changes here were the adoption of rules in 913B to ensure remediation activities do not result in additional adverse impacts. It requires a specific implementation schedule, for remediation projects, requires quarterly updates on all remediation projects. This was a problem in the past where operators would sometimes lose track of projects and not provide updates. Would not provide updates for many months or even years in some cases, unless we prompted them. This will help keep information up to date on all projects. All of this information is also available to the public from the COGCC website. Next slide, please. An additional change to 913 requires operators to update records to reflect the responsible party for all open Form 27 remediation projects upon approval of a Form 9. And a last significant change is the requirement of 4 consecutive quarters of groundwater monitoring in compliance with Table 915-1 standards to receive closure. This was a long-standing practice that staff employed that now will be required by rule. Please note that if circumstances warrant, staff can also request additional monitoring beyond the 4 quarters on a case-by-case basis. Next slide, please. And this is just a slide that shows there's currently a backlog of 1,339 unresolved remediation projects. Through the requirement of the specific implementation schedule, we hope to work with operators to keep these projects on track and ultimately reduce the backlog and the average time to close remediations. Next slide. So this is one of the changes. This is an example of a remediation project with an open excavation that wasn't properly fenced or covered. The new rule requires operators to fence or cover excavations to prevent access when sites aren't attended. This is just a common sense practice to protect public safety, livestock, and wildlife. Next slide. And this is an example of unnecessary surface disturbance we sometimes see during a remediation project. The small rectangle in the center represents an area that was excavated. Instead of bringing trucks in, staging them on the access road, loading them out, and letting them use the existing turnaround to leave the site, trucks were literally driving all over the field, creating ruts, compacting topsoil in an area covering approximately 2 acres. A little planning and site supervision can reduce these types of surface disturbances. Next slide. So Rule 914 is largely unchanged, but represents an important concept. Next slide. If you're not familiar with points of compliance, this slide helps to illustrate the concept. At this location, there was a subsurface release that impacted groundwater. The operator installed an array of monitor wells to delineate the lateral extent of the plume. The contours represent the groundwater surface, indicating a gradient to the south. You can see in the left-hand corner of the slide, there's a river. In this case, the groundwater flows to the south towards the river, and you can see 3 monitor wells with yellow circles along the boundary of the site. Water samples collected from those wells have no contaminants detected, showing that the southernmost extent of the contamination has been defined. The monitor wells with the red circles show elevated levels of benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylenes, where active remediation is needed to reduce those concentrations. Here, the southernmost wells become the point of compliance wells. During remediation, all of these wells are monitored to both track the decline of contaminants as well as the groundwater flow direction. The POC wells act as sentries, if you will, to verify that no contaminants are migrating offsite towards the river. Next slide. And I should say on the last slide that we continue to monitor all of the point of compliance wells to show the decline of contaminants and track the flow direction throughout the life of the project. So moving on to Rule 915, which you've heard previously discussed often about Table 915-1. So it addresses the cleanup standards for contaminants of concern in soil and groundwater. It also addresses the soil suitability standards for surface reclamation. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the changes. And I did want to mention we have Dr. Peter Gintatis and Dr. Denise Arthur, both COGCC staff members, in attendance and available to answer specific questions you might have. I also want to thank both of them for a lot of work that they provided to get this section of the rules updated. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with Table 915-1, it's the table that provides the cleanup concentrations for contaminants of concern in soil and groundwater. The last time it was updated was during the 2008-2009 rulemaking. Since that time, there have been changes to the standards. COGCC does not create the standards, but relies upon CDPHE, Hazardous Materials and Waste Management Division. They exclusively use the EPA regional screening levels for all environmental media other than water. So COGCC, in consultation with CDPHE, adopted the applicable regional screening levels shown on the slide. You will note a change from the previous Table 910-1 that includes 2 columns for each organic compound in soil and for metals in soil. One is the residential soil screening level, which is less stringent or a higher concentration than the column with the protection of groundwater soil screening level concentrations. And that's quite a mouthful. When staff receives a remediation project, moving forward, they will make a determination on which column to use based on factors such as depth to groundwater, soil types, potential migration pathways, etc. I should note that the table includes compounds commonly found in produced fluids and various E&P waste streams. However, it would be impossible to analyze for every individual contaminant of concern, so these are used as the most common indicators for typical wastes. Next slide, please. So Rule 915F was created to establish the criteria for applying the old Table 910-1 standards to ongoing remediation projects if Table 915, to determine if Table 915-1 would apply. And I'll just read the rule for you. Remediations in progress. For sites that are subject to an open Form 19 or Form 27 as of January 15th, 2021, operators may seek the director's permission to comply with the version of Table 910-1 that was previously in effect. If remediation is completed by January 15th, 2022, or if it is completed by that date. If remediation at a site subject to an open Form 19 or Form 27 is not completed by January 15th, 2022, then the operator will comply with the current version of Table 915-1. Next slide. So here's kind of the second half of the table. You will note that we also updated what we now refer to as soil suitability for reclamation standards. So some of the specific changes, electrical conductivity remained unchanged, although we used to have a 2 times background threshold limit, which we removed. However, we will still consider site-specific background determinations for the soil suitability standards and for metals, as indicated in the table and the footnotes. The pH range was adjusted to better reflect a range more optimal for plant growth. And the sodium adsorption ratio, which we refer to as SAR, value was reduced from 12 to 6. And SAR is a calculation that indicates the sodium component of the soil relative to other salts, calcium and magnesium. The most favorable revegetation results occur at a SAR below 6. And last, a standard was set for boron, which is an important micronutrient for plant growth with narrow optimal concentration window. The organic compounds in groundwater were largely unchanged, with the addition of 2 trimethylbenzene constituents that are considered common indicators in certain types of E&P waste. Just like the soil concentrations, COGCC does not create the groundwater standards. Under Senate Bill 89-181, as has previously been discussed, COGCC is an implementing agency of CDPHE Water Quality Control Commission Regulation 41. Reg 41 sets the various groundwater standards. As an implementing agency, COGCC can also request operators to analyze for additional contaminants of concern included in Reg 41. I would like to note that as an implementing agency, we coordinate with the Water Quality Control Division on a regular basis, and they provided important input into the latest version of the rules. Next slide. And you'll be happy to know that this is my last slide. And this is just showing some shots of before and after reclamation. Just wanted to point out how it is very important to evaluate soil suitability during reclamation because it can substantially reduce the duration of these projects. Also reduces issues of erosion, invasive weeds, and returns it to useful habitat faster. Next slide. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and I would open it up to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Axelson. Really tremendous presentation on a lot of different information for all of us and for the state. And appreciate both your and Greg's presentation here. And I just want to thank our staff for the excellent work that was done on, what you put together and presented to us, and that we'll listen to as our stakeholders provide their perspective on this. But just really, you can definitely see there's a lot of rolling up of sleeves and a lot of good work done here. So I just want to thank you for that. Director Murphy, do we move into questions for these latter parts of the 900 series at this point?
Chair, yes. Our staff is available throughout the rulemaking to answer questions. If people are getting hangry and testy, happy to break for lunch and come back. If we want to try to go through questions, that's great. If we want to do some now, some later, we're here for you.
Yeah, and it's our, it's our rulemaking schedule. We've had public comment teed up sort of generally for 1 p.m. and obviously that's going to be a little later today. What's the pleasure of commissioners? Do you want to power through with questions now and then take a short break? Do you want to take a short break and come back with questions and then go to public comment? I could kind of go either way. I don't know if anybody's got any pressing thoughts.
Chair,
yep.
Sorry. I know you just posed a question to commissioners. I was gently reminded that we do have the CDPHE folks available for questions if there are.
Oh, yeah, actually, you're right. There's a whole bunch of them all across the bottom of the screen. So why don't we go into questions now, since we've got all of our panelists as well as CDPHE folks on the line, and then we'll take a break for lunch and then get into public comment this afternoon. So with that, commissioners, who would like to start with questions? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll start off with the $64,000 question, which is several commenters were wondering why we don't just eliminate the usage of new pits altogether and go to tanks. And I'm wondering if staff could address that.
Mr. Geronimo.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I kind of tried to spell that out in that there are certain circumstances where management of E&P waste through pits is really the most, remains the most appropriate way to manage the fluids. One of the significant issues at stake is the volume of fluids that can be managed in a pit. For example, if you've got a pit that holds 250,000 barrels of produced water, it's tough to find tankage and the surface area to set up that tankage to manage that water. They are integral to the water sharing agreements on the west slope in order to store water and then reuse it. We need, the industry needs those volumes of water to be able to be stored and then drawn back into use relatively rapidly.
Mr. Chair, if I may add to that.
Yeah, AG Minor.
I think on a broader framing, what staff did is identify the risks posed by different categories of pits and tailor the rules appropriately, which ranged from prohibition, essentially of the most of pits that pose the greatest environmental impacts, to more tailored restrictions on other types of pits that pose lesser impacts. And again, that gets back to understanding those impacts through Rule 909J with the produced water characterization, and then thinking about the different types of impacts. So Rule 903D6, of course, thinks about air emissions from the pits. Rule 905A4, by requiring waste management plans, allows staff to work with operators on the front end to think about whether pits are the category of E&P waste management that will be most likely to minimize to overall reduce impacts. Rule 909, as we heard, has a lot of substantive standards, including protections for wildlife from pits, as well as livestock that could perhaps enter or drink water from pits that they shouldn't. And finally, Rule 910 protects water, particularly groundwater, and we have Ms. Parrish from CDPHE if there are sort of additional questions about that to ensure that there sort of isn't contamination of surface or groundwater from pits. So staff took essentially a more tailored approach that focuses on different categories of pits and focuses on the individual categories of impacts.
Thank you for that additional information. Does anybody else want to speak to that question? Okay. Commissioner McGowan, did you have any follow-up? Commissioner McGowan.
Sorry, slightly different subject, and I know we got at this at the end. There have been a lot of comments about the table and making sure that the numbers are correct and that we're all aligned. And I feel like we've made corrections now and we have the right numbers, but I just want to clarify that we're at that place for cleanup.
So,
Mr. Atkinson?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Mr. Duranlo?
Yes, Mr. Chair. To answer your question, Commissioner, we are at the correct place. We've coordinated with CDPHE on that, and I believe we have it right.
Other questions? Commissioner Bowe.
Thanks, Chair. This is a question about T-norm. I understand that CDPHE is going through the T-norm rulemaking right now, and I was just wanting some clarification from staff on how we're thinking about T-norm interacting with our cumulative impacts assessment. I'm just thinking about, if a community is downwind from a lot of activity where, there is produced water or drill cuttings that could potentially release, airborne radioactive materials, how that interacts with our cumulative effects analysis, if at all.
Mr. Duranlo?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question really crosses that environmental protection specialist, oil and gas location assessment specialist bridge. And, one of the reasons that all those staff members are environmental protection specialists at the agency, we can start thinking about that now through the CIDR, through the cumulative impacts data evaluation repository that's now, required with the Form 2A. I think we get a window into that earlier in the process, the cumulative impacts evaluation, and our siting considerations, I think definitely do provide that window. And then, the data that we're collecting on the back end through the, the pit water characterization, I think will be helpful to that as well. And, I'm not sure if, Jim, if you want to speak to what's going on your end in the rulemaking over there. That might provide some background too, and sorry to throw you on the spot.
Mr. Grice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what I would say about that is when developing our draft rule for the handling of any of these residuals or waste that may contain T-norm, what we did was we did extensive kind of computer modeling and dose assessments of the handling of these materials to look at anyone who would be either off-site or to include the workers on-site for radiological exposures. And we set our limits for registration and for, I guess, different methods of disposal and handling based on keeping those exposures below 100 millirem, which is the public dose limit for all users of radioactive materials in the state, consistent with our current regulations.
Thank you, Mr. Grice. Any other questions from commissioners? All right, well, I'm not seeing further questions at this point. Perhaps folks are hungry, but we do know that at least our staff will be around during the hearing process to answer questions as we hear from stakeholders on the draft rule set. Anything further, Director Murphy? Nope. Okay, seeing none. It's 12:43. We had set aside 1 hour for lunch. We can continue to do that. I think we tried to give everyone a continued break. That means we would come back at 1:45, and then we have public comment this afternoon. And I think we've got approximately 60 some odd individuals signed up for public comment. So we will look forward to a robust public comment stage this afternoon. Director Murphy, you have unmuted, therefore you might want to say something.
Thank you very much for the depth of attention and listening today. It was not an insubstantial morning.
Yeah, and Director Murphy, I for one would love to get those slides because there's a lot of information there, and I've got my rule set here, I've got my statement of basis and purpose here, I've got all the stakeholder stuff here, but that set of slides would be helpful, I think, as I'm trying to wade through a lot of scientific and technical stuff. So we'll get those slides posted on our website too, so that folks can have access to them. Anything further for the good of the cause before we break? Again, thank you, staff. Excellent work this morning. And we will see everybody in 1 hour at 1:45. So for members of the public, we will return at 1:45, and we'll try to put on the Zoom that we're returning at 1:45 so that you can come back at that time. So thank you, everybody. See you in an hour.